Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is a statement by Paul Wheelhouse on de-crofting by owner-occupier crofters. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Paul Wheelhouse. Minister, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, crofting is very much valued by this Parliament, by the Scottish Government and by myself as a Minister with responsibility for crofting. Clearly, there are many issues of importance in respect of crofting that demand Parliament's attention to ensure that there is a sustainable future for crofting and for the future prosperity of all those who live in Scotland's crofting counties. I look forward to continued engagement with members and stakeholders on those issues, and I am confident that we can deliver together a brighter future for Scotland's crofters. However, Presiding Officer, today I am grateful for this opportunity to inform Parliament of the Scottish Government's intentions for addressing a particular issue which has come to light in relation to the crofting legislation, and specifically the Crofting Reform Scotland Act 2010. The issue concerns the ability of owner-occupier crofters to apply to the Crofting Commission to decroft their croft land. Decrofting is provided for in sections 23, 24 and 25 of the Act. It means removing the land in question from crofting tenure and the provisions of the Act. It can be applied for in relation to all or part of a croft. It might be used, for instance, to allow for a house to be built on decrofted land. This can help to facilitate the handing down of a croft from one generation of a crofting family to the next, or it may enable the building of a dwelling for a new entrant to crofting on a croft that does not currently have such provision for the crofter. The 2010 Act was the first Crofting Act to make specific reference to owner-occupier crofters, even though crofters had for many years enjoyed the right to buy their croft. The 2010 Act rectified this situation by explicitly distinguishing between crofters who are tenants and owner-occupier crofters. Unfortunately, a flaw has come to light in the way in which this distinction applies in the case of decrofting of land on a croft. It was the Scottish Government's intention that tenant and owner-occupier crofters should be treated equally in respect of decrofting, and we believe that this was also Scottish Parliament's intention during the passage of the 2010 Act. However, as some members will be aware, the Crofting Commission has received legal advice which sets out that, in fact, the 2010 Act inadvertently limits the circumstances in which owner-occupier crofters can apply to decroft land. That being the case, the Crofting Commission has decided to suspend the processing of such applications from owner-occupier crofters, a decision which was, of course, not taken lightly. Since the problem came to light, the Scottish Government, along with the Crofting Commission, has taken a number of steps. First, in the manner of due diligence, it was necessary to confirm our belief that the will of Scottish Parliament was indeed that owner-occupier crofters, as well as tenant crofters, should be able to decroft. That required us to check carefully the documentation relating to the preparation of the 2010 Act. Having satisfied ourselves on that point, the Scottish Government naturally considered whether it would be possible to overcome the flaw in the Act without recourse to legislation. I know that others have also done their own analysis on this point. It had been suggested to us that ministers could simply direct the Crofting Commission to continue to process and sign off on applications. Unfortunately, the advice to ministers is clear. No such solution exists under the terms of the Act. This means that in order to correct the flaw in question, an amendment to the crofting legislation is therefore required. The Scottish Government has also had discussions with stakeholder organisations, including the Scottish Crofting Federation and NFUS, as well as the Commission itself, of course. In light of those discussions and our analysis, today I wish to inform Parliament that the Scottish Government intends to bring forward a bill as soon as possible after the Easter recess to address this issue. It is my intention to propose a timetable for the bill which will enable the Parliament to consider carefully the proposed changes, whilst ensuring the matter is resolved quickly. However, in opening the doors for owner-occupier crofters to decroft their land, we should recognise the vital importance that croft land plays in the life of this country and of the crofting counties in particular. Crofting brings multiple benefits to our nation. It supports the social and cultural fabric of many communities. It maintains agricultural production in the Highlands and Islands. And it does so in a way that delivers the environmental benefits that come from extensive grazed livestock systems. And while comparatively few crofters are full-time, crofting makes a significant contribution to the economies of the crofting counties. Given these important benefits that crofting provides, members will want to be assured that in supporting the bill I am announcing today, they will not be opening the floodgates and allowing massive decrofting to take place. And I am happy to give that assurance. The precise form of the bill will have to be worked out with the parliamentary draftsman, as there is more than one potential way to draft the bill to address this particular technical issue. But our clear intention is that the safeguards which apply to other forms of de-crofting, including the need for approval by the Crofting Commission, will also apply in involving owner-occupier crofter cases. I know that several members have been contacted by crofters who are quite understandably concerned about this issue. I mentioned that the Commission has suspended the processing of applications which are currently in the pipeline. That was the only possible decision the Crofting Commission could reasonably take in the circumstances of the legal advice it had received. But I am aware that the effective moratorium has left nearly 60 crofters in an uncertain position, not knowing when or even whether their de-crofting application might be approved. There are also over 170 cases in which the Commission had already granted approval to de-croft in good faith before this problem came to light. In the Government's view, it is essential that their situation is addressed as part of the solution, and I hope Parliament will support us in that. Presiding Officer, I am very grateful to members representing crofting counties and others for the details they have sent me or my officials about the impact being felt by crofters on the ground. This has been a very helpful supplement to the information I have had from the Commission itself. All this information has contributed to the Government's conclusion that the legislation should be amended. While I cannot discuss the specifics of individuals or families involved, I can give some examples of the kinds of impact that owner-occupier crofters face. Some owner-occupier crofters are unable to start building their house until the land is decrofted, and yet time-limited planning consent has been granted and therefore deadlines for completion may be approaching. Others are unable to decroft to increase the size of the house site, to extend their house and provide sufficient garden ground for the extended house. Another young crofter feels unable to proceed with acquiring part of an owner-occupier crofter's croft because of the uncertainty of being able to decroft part of his new croft to build a house for himself to live in. A young crofting couple planning to start a family are unable to decroft the house site to sell to finance a larger house while retaining the original croft land. And there are other examples of owner-occupier crofters being unable to decroft wind turbine sites or other parcels of croft land for development in the knowledge that personal financial investment will be required. I believe these examples demonstrate the importance of addressing the issue quickly but effectively. Any move to request expedited parliamentary consideration of a bill is not taken lightly, but I do believe it is necessary in this instance based upon the evidence of difficulty faced by crofters. I am therefore grateful to Parliament for this opportunity to announce the Scottish Government's intentions in relation to this decrofting issue in the 2010 Act. I hope this gives some comfort to crofters that a solution is on its way, and I understand the very real concern that exists in the crofting communities, and I look forward to receiving Parliament's support in the coming months to resolve this issue in the interests of owner-occupier crofters who are being disadvantaged and in the interests of crofting as a whole. Thank you.
That ends the statement from the Minister. Members who wish to ask a question of the Minister should press the request to speak button now. And I call Claire Baker. Ms Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Minister for an advance copy of his statement. This is not the first time this session the Government has had to seek to reverse a decision on crofting, and it's not good enough. Will the Minister apologise to the crofters who have been affected over this recent situation? It is deeply worrying for the 179 crofters who have already decrofted and the 60 who are waiting to do so, but it is perhaps not surprising that there are problems with the 2010 Crofting Act. At the time, Labour called for a greater scrutiny of the bill, but the Government pushed through legislation which is now shown to be flawed. The Minister in his statement said there is more than one potential way to draft the bill. Although the Government accept the need for emergency legislation, they don't yet know what form that will take. Can the Minister say more about timescales? Will we be in a position to start work on this immediately after recess? And for those that are still left in limbo until new legislation is passed, is it not possible to use the 1993 Act in the meantime? The longer the situation continues, the greater financial pressure is being put on crofters across Scotland. And in bringing forward emergency legislation, will the Scottish Government allow independent scrutiny of the Act to guard against any further flaws?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, firstly, can I just say how disappointed I am in Claire Baker's attitude in this issue. This is a very serious matter, and to make party political points is pointless. I just point out to Claire Baker in the past Parliament, when this legislation was passed, this particular party in government did not have a majority. They had no majority on the committee either. It's a serious issue. It does require cross-party support. I hope, following this session, that Claire Baker reflects on her comments and chooses to take a more bipartisan approach to address this issue Clearly, there is a flaw. I recognise that in the legislation. I'm not denying that. But we have to take an action as a Parliament to make sure this is addressed quickly. And in light of her comments, point out it's not emergency legislation as such. We're talking about a short crofting bill, but using potentially, with the will of Parliament, expedited procedures.
Jim McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Minister for an early insight of his statement. I pledge Scottish Conservative support in principle to enable the proposed bill to go through relevant stages of Parliament as quickly as possible in order to remedy this very unfortunate situation that has, as the Minister suggested, caused uncertainty and worry to a number of crofting constituents. Will the emergency legislation clarify the legal position with regard to de-crofting of a croft that has been divided, as at the moment the Crofting Commission is saying that if you own part of a croft, you cannot de-croft within that part without the concurrence of your neighbours who own the remainder of what was the original croft? I apologise for the complicated answer to that. And also, what answer does the Minister... Has consideration been given to an interim measure that allows applications to be progressed up to the point of issue, but without a de-crofting direction being issued until a solution required is in place? And finally, what answer does the Minister have to those owner-occupier crofters who face any financial loss because of the current predicament they find themselves in?
Minister.
On the matter of looking at de-crofting of a croft that has been divided, I will write to the member to give him clarity on that point. I recognise it's an issue that's been raised by at least one lawyer in the context of the CPG on crofting, and we will address that. So give him an undertaking on that. In terms of the issue about processing applications, I can tell the member that we have communicated with Crofting Commission to request that they do consider that and come back to us with an opinion on whether they could process the applications that are in the pipeline to ensure that once legislation with the will of Parliament is progressed, that we're in a position to quickly respond and ensure that people aren't given any undue delay. On the issue of financial losses, that's something we will take into consideration to look at what sort of financial losses have been incurred. I'm not aware of anything having presented to me as yet as to an actual financial loss, but of course we'll listen to any evidence that members have at their disposal.
Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Minister's statement about a speedy and safe solution which is proposed, and I suppose it may well come to the committee that I convene, and I'm sure that the members will help to scrutinise it thoroughly and quickly. I wonder if the Minister can help me about the people who are caught by the legal hitch which has been uncovered in the 2010 Crofting Act, who are between de-crofting and legitimate house building and diversification plans. Can a cast-iron guarantee be given for them to begin planning processes for new uses for the de-crofted land on a date ahead of the legislation being completed to amend the Act in Parliament?
Minister.
The member, Rob Gibson, raises an extremely important point. I certainly welcome his support for the steps we're taking. As regards planning, I do realise that this could, as I indicated in the speech, present real problems for people who have already got a planning permission that's running out. But because the solution requires legislation, the government cannot dictate the exact timetable of when the bill will be passed, and that clearly is a matter which is the will of Parliament, and I would hope that we have support with that. We will need to agree a timetable with the parliamentary authorities and business managers, which we'll publicise as soon as practically possible so that crofters can amend their projects accordingly to take that into account. There's nothing in theory to stop crofters from starting the planning process before their de-crofting application is being processed, if they wish to do so. They should not proceed with a change of use until such time as the de-crofting has been approved, which will require the new legislation to have been passed, again with the will of Parliament. But there is no obstacle to Mr Gibson's constituents engaging with the planning process in the meantime.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I thank the Minister for sight of his statement. It's already been highlighted that over 170 people whose land has been de-crofted will no longer have a title to their property and may not be able to secure lending in the interim, and may have to indeed to wait in order to sell. What is the Scottish Government doing to help them specifically financially and legally? Thank you.
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity to clarify something. It's my understanding that title is not actually affected for those people in this position, so I hope that gives some reassurance to the member. My understanding, there may be an implication for the valuation on the land because it was assumed to be no longer in crofting use, so it's been decrofted, or that's what the owner of the property had assumed, and the lender, obviously. So we are aware that there is a potential issue. It depends on the attitude of the lender, obviously, as to the valuation that's placed on that land, because it may be treated as an agricultural value rather than housing value. And that's one of the reasons, because of the implication for standard securities rather than title, that we're keen to progress this legislation as quickly as possible.
Dave Thompson, followed by Tavish Scott.
I thank the Minister for his statement today and for the speedy resolution of this very difficult and complex matter. Unfortunately, we all live in the real world. You know, things go wrong and we just have to put them right, and that is what the Minister and the Government are doing. Can I ask him, however, once the legislation is passed through this Parliament, is the Crofting Commission going to be in a position to deal quickly with any backlog that has built up of decrofting applications and so on, because of this legislative problem? And if not, will they be given help to ensure that they can deal with these applications very quickly indeed?
Minister. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Certainly, it relates to the point I mentioned earlier with regard to Jamie McGregor's question. Certainly, we will do whatever we can to try and support those crofters in that position. Clearly, the Crofting Commission is responsible for processing applications, and that's why we have asked the Crofting Commission to look at how they could take existing decrofting applications for owner-occupier crofters forward as far as possible, short of obviously actually approving the decrofting application, so that when we do get to the point where, with the will of Parliament, we have legislation passed, they're in a position where they can quickly capitalise on that and minimise any future delay.
Tavish Scott, followed by Rhoda Grant.
Presiding Officer, in thanking the Minister for his statement, you will recall the Mental Health Bill of 1999, which we passed from introduction to royal assent in 13 days, if I got my numbers correctly. Can I commend that approach to the Minister? I appreciate that he's got to have all party support. He certainly has it from this side of the chamber. And will he undertake to work with MSPs? There are probably not that many of us who are directly affected by this on a cross-party basis to resolve the legislation as quickly as possible, given due account to proper scrutiny, and make sure we do get this fixed as quickly as possible.
Minister.
Absolutely, and can I, Presiding Officer, welcome both the support of Jamie McGregor and indeed Tavish Scott in terms of their respective party positions. I think in order to facilitate a very quick progress of this bill, we do need to work together as a Parliament, and I'm certainly give my undertaking that I will work as closely as we possibly can with the members to ensure that we speed this position to a swift conclusion.
Rhoda Grant, to be followed by Dr Alistair Allen.
The Government has legal advice. Will they now publish it to enable solicitors to properly advise clients, and will they fund such legal advice? Will they also look to paying builders and others in the supply chain who have already undertaken work and incurred costs that can no longer be paid for by the crofter because of this flawed legislation? Minister.
Well, on the issue of the financial costs to those who are involved with projects, I would certainly welcome any evidence that Rhoda Grant can provide to me, so I can understand the full scale of the issues she's referring to. I'd rather not make a statement today on how we would respond to that, but clearly we do recognise that this was not an intended position to put those suppliers in. So I will do whatever I can with sympathy to look at their position, but I really do need to see the detail of what kind of costs we're facing before giving a response. On the issue about legal advice, I'm sure the member knows sort of the constraints in terms of legal advice, but certainly we will try and make clear as we possibly can in progressing this bill exactly why we think the legislation is currently flawed and what we need to do to rectify it. So I give our undertaking that we will try and give as much clarity as to the rationale for having to take this action as possible.
Dr Alistair Allen, followed by Mike Mackenzie.
While only a minority of my own Crofting constituents are owner-occupiers, the Crofting community generally will certainly welcome the Minister's intention to close this loophole. And while he has indicated this will be an expedited measure, can he nonetheless indicate what he will do to seek the views of crofters regarding the content of this legislative measure as it makes its way through Parliament?
Minister.
Clearly, we do want to progress this legislation as quickly as possible, but as I've said in my statement, we want to give due opportunity for scrutiny. And obviously, aside from working with other parties in the Parliament, I'm very keen that we work closely with the Scottish Crofting Federation and indeed NFUS and others who will have an interest in this. And I give an undertaking to the member that if he has any particular suggestions as to how I consult with crofters in his constituency, I'm happy to look at that.
Mike Mackenzie, followed by Jane Baxter.
I welcome the Minister's statement. I'm sure he is aware that concerns have been raised by NFU Scotland that some crofters who have entered into renewable energy agreements may not be able to take their projects forward due to the de-crofting issue. Can the Minister assure Parliament that owner-occupier crofters will not be put at a disadvantage in taking forward renewable energy projects?
Minister.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I cannot guarantee that what we will do, because it is dependent on the will of Parliament, both in terms of the legislation being passed and indeed matters out with my control in terms of progressing the renewable energy projects themselves. But I've said in my statement that the Scottish Government is very aware of the practical difficulties faced by owner-occupiers, many of whom who may well have renewable projects in mind. And the course of action I've set out today, I hope, will rectify the problem as soon as reasonably possible for all owner-occupier crofters, including those that have renewable projects. But as I say, it will depend on the will of Parliament, and the timing of it will also depend on discussions with parliamentary authorities.
Jane Baxter, to be followed finally by Jean Urquhart.
Thank you, and thanks to the Minister for his statement. Further to Mike Mackenzie's question, I'd like to ask how many of the 60 crofters currently waiting for their application to be approved are tied into renewable energy projects which require de-crofting, and what are the implications for these fledgling enterprises in light of this, as the Minister put it, inadvertent flaw in the Act?
Minister. I must apologise to Jane Baxter. I don't have a split of the 60 applicants and as to what kinds of projects we're going forward. I can give an undertaking we will investigate that and try and come back to her in writing with an answer. But clearly, as she recognises, it is an unintended flaw. We're taking the steps we feel are necessary to put that right, and I hope that we have her support and the support of her party in resolving that situation.
Jean Urquhart.
Thank you, and can I thank the Minister for his statement, the fact that he's brought that to the Parliament as speedily as he has done. I would like to reassure the Minister too that in any communication I've had, I think most people do understand that it was an unforeseen circumstance of the bill, and not blaming the then government of the country. But most of the questions I think that I was going to ask have been about timescale and process. But can I ask the Minister if you would be in a position to give reassurance to people that they could actually continue to process applications, and that the whole situation isn't frozen at this time, and that I think that would give reassurance that actually we're about to correct the bill and not to change it or to create any other, that there would be nothing else would impede the progress that's being made.
Minister.
Well, certainly, I can assure Jean Urquhart that it's our intention to focus purely on sorting this problem out. We'll do it as quickly as we can reasonably come to an agreement within this Parliament to do so. I appreciate the point she's making about trying to allow further applications to come forward. I think probably it would be sensible at this stage to say to those who are considering an application, yes, progress your plans, think about what you want to do, and to have discussions if it's renewables or housing projects with those who are appropriate. But we will, I think, for all sorts of reasons to do with standard securities and mortgages and so forth, we will need to rectify this problem before it would be possible for someone to put forward an application. And I think at this stage it would be sensible on their part to wait until such time as they have clarity with the amendment to the law.
That ends the statement from the Minister. We now move early to the next item of business. The next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings on the High-Hedges Scotland Bill. In dealing with amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is SP Bill 16A, the Marshall List, that is SP Bill 16A-ML, and the groupings, that is SP Bill 16A-G. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division of the afternoon. The period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds. Thereafter, I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after the debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible after I call the group. Members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. And I call amendment number 5 in the name of Anne McTaggart and a group of its own. Anne McTaggart to move and speak to amendment number 5. Ms McTaggart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to begin this debate today by moving to my amendment number 5. This amendment seeks to achieve the same effect as to which I had first proposed in stage 2 at the Local Government Committee and later withdrew on the strength of an undertaking from the Minister to consider the issue in some detail. This amendment seeks to expand the definition what is considered to be a high hedge, so that the bill will not be unnecessarily restrictive in its approach and will be able to offer remedies to those who are suffering from the high hedge disputes, irrespective of type of hedge or nuisance vegetation concerned. The current definition of or row or 2 or more evergreen or semi-evergreen trees or shrubs in Section 1, subsection 1A, is unnecessarily restrictive, and I am concerned that the exclusion of deciduous species will leave some of the worst long-standing disputes without resolutions to the problems they face. Therefore, my amendment seeks to amend this provision to remove evergreen and semi-evergreen altogether and change the definition of high hedges to simply a row of 2 or more trees or shrubs. This approach will enable the inclusion of deciduous species by default, as it will exclude no species of shrub, tree or hedge from the bill. This means that homeowners suffering from high hedge disputes are more likely to be successful in achieving resolutions to neighbour disputes and will not be restricted from achieving such an outcome as a result of subtle technicality. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. As Anne McTaggart knows, we've had a long discussion about this. We've been uphill, down dale, trying to find a way to get deciduous in. And the simplest thing was to just delete everything else and make it shrubs or trees of 2. And I think it seems frivolous, but it's not really, because in the discussions at stage 2, and I remember saying at the time at stage 1, I feel an amendment coming on. You obviously felt it coming on faster, not a problem. At stage 2 was that in certain parts of the country, of course, shrubs that might and trees that we might say are deciduous simply aren't. Beech retains its leaves in many parts of Scotland. A thick beech hedge, big beech hedge, can be as impenetrable to light and to block reasonable living next door. So I'm very much delighted with this simple. Sometimes the solutions in life, Ms McTaggart, are simple, not often, but this is one of them. And I'm delighted to support this because, of course, mischievous people, had we just left it at evergreen or semi-evergreen, could simply have gone out, and we know sometimes it's vindictive, and planted a deciduous hedge that in fact didn't do what it was supposed to do on the seed packet and didn't drop its leaves at all. So very much happy to support this, and I hope that the member in charge and the Minister will support this simple but important amendment.
Many thanks. Now call on Sarah Byatt.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm very glad that this amendment has been put in front of us. We debated this at stage 1 and then again at stage 2. And I suppose my sense is that we could address this issue today, or we could wait another 5 years. Because it's pretty clear that some of the people where there are the most deeply held conflicts, if we don't pass this amendment today, those conflicts will still remain. And I think this is our opportunity to put in a framework that's a rigorous framework and to make sure it's done in a coherent way. So I very much support the amendment that Anne McTaggart has put in. It will not keep everybody happy, because the nature of these disputes is that they tend to be long-standing and deeply held views, but it would provide a resolution process. And I think that's what this amendment is about. So I hope the Minister will be able to support it today. It's been a good discussion at stage 1 and stage 2. And this amendment going through, I think, would strengthen the bill overall. And of course, we'd have to review over time, but I think it's better to be in at this stage rather than come back in 5 years' time and wish we'd done it and then have to allocate more parliamentary time. So I support the amendment.
Many thanks. I now call on Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The issue of whether an inclusion of deciduous trees has been one...
Microphone, please, Ms Mitchell. Microphone.
Oh, sorry, is it on? Sorry. The issue of whether we should include deciduous trees in the bill has been one which was discussed at length in the committee. There was compelling evidence presented by High-Hedges for the inclusion of these trees in the bill. In fact, they suggested that 1 in 5 cases where quality of life and enjoyment of property were affected involved deciduous trees, and therefore the definition should be amended to include deciduous trees in their own right. Equally, there were concerns from other organisations. It is a complex issue, Presiding Officer, but having considered all of the issues at length, then the Scottish Conservatives are minded to support their own amendment in Anne McTaggart's name this evening.
Many thanks. Now calling Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Just a couple of comments. First of all, I do welcome the amendment in the name of Anne McTaggart, and I'm quite delighted that I dissented at stage 1 to actually keep this particular item on the agenda, so we could discuss it further, certainly at stage 2 and also today. I've got one question that I hope that Anne McTaggart might be able to answer when she's summing up, and that's just in terms of with this amendment going forward, can she provide any type of information regarding an increase of cases that might actually be covered by this amendment, so that when we are actually discussing issues with our constituents after today, that we can maybe provide a bit more clarity regarding the cases that they actually have.
Thank you very much. Now calling Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I apologise for coming into the chamber a wee bit late for this debate, given the early start.
Noted.
Given that, I may have missed something in Anne McTaggart's initial comments, and I hope that she'll be able to reprise them in her closing remarks if she has covered this already. But Scottish Wildlife Trust and RSPB have given evidence arguing against these amendments, particularly in relation to the possible impact on biodiversity. And one constituent has written, urban biodiversity is increasingly important for both birds and pollinators, many of whom are suffering serious decline. Green corridors through cities can be critical, and large trees are essential for that to be viable for many species. I wonder if Anne McTaggart would respond to those criticisms, both from the constituent I'm quoting and from the 2 NGOs who've given evidence.
Minister. Derek Mackay.
Amendment 5 from Anne McTaggart reflects the amendment she proposed at stage 2 and seeks to widen the bill's definition of a high hedge to include all types of trees and shrubs, removing the terms evergreen and semi-evergreen from section 1. I said at stage 1 that the government had quite a relaxed view of the bill's definition and would listen to what Parliament thinks is the appropriate way forward. I did make clear, however, that I would want to return to local government to consult if we were to propose changing the definition substantially. I therefore wrote to local authorities at stage 2 to seek their views on the potential impact of widening the definition of a high hedge in the ways proposed. I remain grateful to Anne McTaggart for agreeing to withdraw her amendment at stage 2 to enable the government to consider the responses from local authorities on the proposed change before reaching a decision on the issue. I have now received a total of 18 responses from local authorities. There was a broad mix of responses. One council welcomed the amendments, whilst another council agreed that the amendments should be made. A further council had no issues with the amendments, and there were 2 councils who had no comments. However, the remaining councils raised objections to the amendments. Those objections included concerns that the amendments would capture field hedgerows, the potential impacts of wildlife, and the appearances of towns, and that decisions would be more difficult, time-consuming and costly to make. Some of those concerns also reflected representations I have received from the Scottish Wildlife Trust and RSPB Scotland regarding the potential impact on biodiversity of widening the definition. I have discussed these issues with Mark MacDonald and considered how these concerns can be best addressed. I think the key is to ensure that the Government's guidance to local authorities makes clear how these considerations should be taken into account in reaching decisions on high hedges. I am satisfied that the bill will enable that to happen and have every confidence that local authorities will. Of course.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful. I wonder if the Minister could reflect on the biodiversity arguments as well as those that he's listed. Will that specifically be taken into consideration in guidance?
Derek Mackay.
Yeah, I'm sure that is a reasonable request and can be taken into consideration when the guidance is produced and issued in due course. I have every confidence that local authorities will use the guidance appropriately and be able to take proper account of all these concerns in reaching their decisions. I know that the first step in that process took place on Monday this week, when representatives of local authorities across Scotland attended a meeting with government officials in Edinburgh to discuss implementation of this legislation. I have confirmed to Mark MacDonald that the Government would welcome the participation of the Scottish Wildlife Trust and RSPB at future meetings on the development of the guidance to ensure that their concerns are addressed. I am also content that the bill provides that local authorities can recover the costs associated with High-Hedges, but I am happy to keep that under review as part of the Government's ongoing dialogue with local authorities on this issue. In conclusion, therefore, I can confirm that the Government will support Anne McTaggart's amendment number 5.
Many thanks. I now call on Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As I have taken the bill forward, I have been keen to listen to the views of members, as well as those of interested organisations and professionalisms and representations from members of the public. I know, therefore, that many are happy that the bill's current definition of a high hedge will solve the vast majority of high hedge problems, the typical scenario being fast-growing conifers. And while the current definition includes hedges containing deciduous trees and shrubs, so long as they do not form a majority of the hedge, I have been conscious that the current definition would not deal with problems caused by high hedges which are wholly or mainly composed of deciduous trees or shrubs. While wholly deciduous high hedges would typically pose less of a problem than coniferous hedges in respect of forming a barrier to light, I wanted to ensure that the bill solves as many problems as possible, and therefore I have had some sympathy for those I have spoken to or who have written to me about problems with deciduous hedges. The question for me has been whether the bill can be extended in that way without causing problems for its operation in practice. Some of the potential problems have been highlighted in correspondence to which Patrick Harvey alluded and which members will have received recently from the Scottish Wildlife Trust and RSPB. Their correspondence re-emphasises the points they raised in evidence at Stage 1 about the greater wildlife and biodiversity value of deciduous trees in comparison to conifers, underlines their concerns about the potential for a wider definition to have a negative impact on biodiversity. Now, these are important issues which deserve serious consideration, and officials supporting me in taking forward this bill met both organisations at a very early stage in its development to ensure that my consideration has been fully informed. As a result, I am aware that there are already many measures in place to protect wildlife and biodiversity, ranging from legislation such as the Nature Conservation Scotland Act 2004 through to local authorities' own biodiversity action plans. So local authorities will need to take all of these protections into account in making decisions in relation to high hedges, and I am satisfied that they are capable of doing so. But for this to happen in practice, it is important that the guidance to be issued on the operation of this legislation by the Government should provide full details of these issues. Now, I have discussed this with the Minister, and he has agreed that the Scottish Wildlife Trust and RSPB will be invited to contribute to and comment on the guidance before it is published to ensure that it fully addresses their concerns. And I have written to both organisations to confirm this and hope they will accept the Minister's invitation to actively participate in the development of the guidance. Finally, I have been keen to ensure that this bill provides local authorities with a means of resolving disputes without demanding that they find additional resources to do so. And I was pleased that the Minister for Local Government and Planning wrote to local authorities at Stage 2 to consult them on the potential impact of widening the bill's definition. I believe that the majority of the issues raised by local authorities about the potential impact can also be addressed through the guidance which will be produced by the Government. I know that they will be fully involved in that and welcome the Minister's confirmation that the initial meeting to discuss implementation earlier this week was a positive one. The main issue which cannot be addressed by way of guidance is the concerns expressed by some authorities about the potential for additional costs to be incurred in dealing with deciduous hedges. But I am satisfied that the bill provides local authorities can charge on a cost recovery basis, and also that the flexibility exists for different fees to be charged for different types of case should local authorities choose to do so. And I believe that should enable local authorities to address any issues around additional costs should that prove to be the case in practice. Taking all this into account, I am happy to agree to support Anne McTaggart's amendment number 5 and would urge all members to do likewise.
Many thanks. I now call on Anne McTaggart to wind up and press or withdraw her amendment.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased that the Minister for Local Government and Mark MacDonald, the member in charge of the bill, has fully considered my amendment and will be supporting expansion of the definition of a high hedge. I am grateful to have received some cross-party support on the issue and thank all those who have provided thoughtful contributions to the debate. I recognise the importance of protecting biodiversity in all areas of Scotland. I am reassured that this bill will not negatively impact on local wildlife populations. I anticipate that the bill will apply to only a limited number of cases where all other options have been exhausted. In these circumstances, I believe it is right that we offer homeowners a remedy to ongoing disputes and an opportunity to remove intrusive trees and hedges from neighbouring properties. In response to the member Stuart McMillan's question, the increase of cases and obviously the impact of financial concerns following from the expansion of Section 1, I would like to reassure members the Section 25 provisions allow local authorities to recover the costs of enforcement, and I believe it is clear that this expansion of the definition would not prove to be vastly increased financial burden on local government. Campaign group Scott Hedge have recognised that only 20% of the members suffer from deciduous high hedge disputes and anticipate the increased workload to be minimal in practice. Presiding Officer, I support the High Hedges Bill as a means to resolving situations of community breakdown following a dispute over hedges in a neighbouring property. However, I do believe that this bill should be fit for purpose and offer a remedy to all those suffering from these issues. That is why I have proposed Amendment 5 and why I believe strongly that it would increase both the scope and effectiveness of the bill. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. And so the question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. Good. I call Amendment 2 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, grouped with Amendment 3 and 4. Margaret Mitchell to move Amendment 2 and speak to all amendments in the group, please.
Move Amendment 2 in my name, Presiding Officer. Amendment 2 seeks to reduce the maximum number of years from 5 to 2 years, after which a review must be carried out. Whilst the amendment at stage 2, which was passed to ensure a review to the legislation, was very welcome, this sets an upper level of 5 years for the review, which I believe is potentially too long. Instead, I consider that the bill will have sufficiently bedded down after 2 years, and that a review, especially now that deciduous trees have been included, could and should be carried out as soon as possible thereafter. So Amendment 3, which I also move in my name, is that correct? I speak to all the rest in the block. Yeah. So Amendment 3 in my name reduces the period which is allowed for the report on the bill's operation to be published not in 18 months but instead within 12 months. As the bill stands, a report on... yes, certainly.
Mark MacDonald.
I wonder if Mrs Mitchell would agree that the stipulations she seeks to impose through these amendments, there is actually nothing in the current drafting of the review clause that would prevent either an earlier review or indeed an earlier report.
I concede that, but equally I would point out to the member that it could potentially be 5 years and in effect 6.5 years, which is the point I'm coming on to, nothing stopping it being that very long time either. So as the bill stands, the report on the bill's operation must be published within 18 months of a decision to review being made. This means, and this is the point I wanted to emphasise, that with a review period of up to 5 years being included, a final report could potentially take up to 6.5 years before being published, which I think is far too long. And I move amendment for my name, Presiding Officer. Finally, Amendment 4 specifies 4 different aspects that must be covered in any report on the operation of the bill. It should be noted that any report will not be limited to these areas, but must include comment on them. These 4 areas are as follows. Firstly, how local authorities have exercised their functions under the bill. Secondly, what implementation the bill has cost, local authorities. Thirdly, any issues that have arisen regarding the definition as introduced. And finally, whether the definition of high hedges should be amended to include specific reference to deciduous trees and shrubs. These last two provisions, I contend, are even more important given the inclusion of Anne McTaggart's amendment to the bill. For example, the inclusion of deciduous trees in the amendment is there in effect by default. This amendment in my name to review it, to look again at the issue, would ensure that consideration is given as to whether to include a specific reference to deciduous trees in the bill. Finally, Presiding Officer, while these aspects would be expected to be covered by any report on the bill's operation, this amendment ensures they definitely will be looked at and considered.
Many thanks. And now Colin Stewart-Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think we very much welcome the amendment in the name of Christine Graham and moved by Anne McTaggart. And supported by Christine Graham, I'm reminded. I think in many ways the context of that amendment touches upon what Margaret Mitchell wishes to do here, where essentially my understanding when I look at Amendment 4, at the very last part, the context is the need for the definition of high hedges to be changed. I think now that that is no longer part of what might be reasonably included in Amendment 4, the whole rationale for this set of amendments falls. I do note that in her contribution to the debate, Margaret Mitchell offered no specific arguments in favour of the reduction from 5 years to 2 years and from 18 months to 12 months. Now, these numbers are, in a sense, arbitrary, but I would argue for the 5 years because I think this is an issue which is going to touch 32 local authorities and indeed the 2 national parks. It will be that the experience in different parts of Scotland will be quite different. In the north east of Scotland, the climate is very different from the south west. The issue, insofar as it exists at the same level as the south west, will be quite different. And I think it will be very unlikely that we have anything approximating to a complete understanding of the effect of this bill within a period of 2 years. I'll listen carefully to any arguments that say otherwise, but I would certainly not be minded at this stage to support any of these amendments, the context for which I think has now been overtaken by events and the argument for which, in relation to the numbers, has not really been made.
Many thanks. And now Colin Stewart-McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just a couple of points again on these amendments. I put forward the original amendment, 31A of the bill, and I actually put that forward because I thought that the 5-year period of time was a measured approach to examining the legislation going forward. Now, certainly Stevenson just said there that regarding the 5-year period, much of that was regarding the definition, because obviously we still had the issue of should the definition be widened or be maintained as a narrow definition. Stevenson was correct that I think events have overtaken these particular range of amendments. But also, I think it's worthwhile considering that if these amendments actually were to be accepted today, then this particular session of Parliament will actually once again be looking at the issue of high hedges towards the end of this session. And I don't think that the public would actually thank us for doing that. So I therefore do suggest that I would hope that Margaret Mitchell would consider these particular points, because I don't think the public actually want us to consider high hedges once again in this particular session. So I would hope that Margaret Mitchell would consider actually withdrawing the amendments later on today. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I call on the Minister, Derek Mackay.
I will speak to Amendments 2, 3 and 4. Amendments 2 and 3 seek to impose a tighter timeframe on the review period as set out in Section 31A, and a tighter timeframe on when a report must be made by a committee or subcommittee of the Parliament. Amendment 4 details what should be scrutinised by that subcommittee. Amendments 2 and 3 are both less time than has already been agreed to at Stage 2, when the committee agreed to Stuart McMillan's amendment adding Section 31A to the bill. Margaret Mitchell suggests that it might be 6.5 years before a report about that review was forthcoming, but this is the absolute maximum. At stage 2, I made the point that the committee would not want to be bound by a timescale that provided no flexibility. I would reiterate this point. Shortening the maximum review period to 2 years and the maximum reporting period to 1 year after that effectively gives no discretion to the committee to determine its own priorities and the appropriate timescales. Turning to Amendment 4, post-legislative scrutiny is not necessary for every piece of legislation that we produce. If it was, that would suggest that we did not have confidence in the legislation that we had considered and enacted. A mandatory reporting requirement such as that in Section 31A needs particular justification. I understand that the committee had particular concerns in relation to this bill, and that is why we have Section 31A. It was agreed by the committee at stage 2 to reflect particular concerns that were being expressed and to provide comfort of post-legislative scrutiny on this particular piece of legislation. However, I do have strong concerns about going any further than Section 31A. It is one thing to require a committee to report by a certain date, but another to dictate in detail on the terms of its report also. I think members can leave it up to the committee itself to determine the content of its report. For this reason, I would encourage members to resist the amendment, and I would therefore urge members not to support these amendments.
Thank you very much. I now call on Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While I'm grateful that Margaret Mitchell did not bring back some of the amendments that she withdrew at stage 2, I am nevertheless disappointed that she sought to pursue these amendments. These amendments seek to set a shorter timeframe on the review period as set out in Section 31A and a shorter timeframe on the period for making a report after review, as well as detailing on the face of the bill what should be scrutinised in that report. Section 31A was added at stage 2 following a committee recommendation for post-legislative scrutiny, and the recommendation from the committee, unanimously endorsed by the committee, suggested a 5-year period. This is in the amended bill, but members should note that Stuart McMillan's amendment is flexible enough to allow that period to be shortened should a future committee wish to do so. Section 31A provides that the review period shall end 5 years after the day on which Section 2 comes into force, or such earlier day as may be determined by the committee or subcommittee making the report. Therefore, if the committee decides to do so, it may already set a shorter timeframe for the review period if it so wishes. Section 31A also provides that a report must be made no later than 18 months after the end of the review period. Again, this means that the committee or subcommittee can make the report earlier if it so wishes. And I'm satisfied this gives a sufficient balance between a certainty that the legislation will be reviewed within 5 years and a flexibility for the committee itself to make a judgment on when best it should conduct its business. Amendment 4 seeks to ensure that any report on the operation of the Act considers how local authorities have exercised their functions under the Act, the costs they have incurred in exercising those functions, any issues arising from the meaning of a high hedge, and whether the definition of a high hedge should be amended to apply also to a row of 2 or more deciduous trees or shrubs. Of course, as we have amended Section 1 of the bill to allow deciduous trees to be included, the requirement in Amendment 4 for the report to assess whether deciduous trees or shrubs should be included does not appear to make sense. For that reason alone, I would ask Margaret Mitchell not to move that amendment. But I think it also illustrates the danger of trying to determine in detail in legislation how a committee of this Parliament goes about its business. I'm perfectly happy to leave that committee to determine for itself what should be in its report, rather than to impose prescriptive detail on the face of legislation, as is being suggested by Margaret Mitchell. Section 31A is there to guarantee post-legislative scrutiny of this new piece of legislation. I'm satisfied it meets this purpose without any amendment. I would ask Margaret Mitchell to withdraw Amendment 2 and not to move Amendments 3 and 4. Otherwise, I would urge members to resist Amendments 2, 3 and 4.
Many thanks. Margaret Mitchell to wind up and press to withdraw her amendments.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The combination of these 3 amendments really does ensure that there's clarity, that, especially with Amendment 4, that deciduous trees are included rather than as the current situation, merely included by default. And I think that improves the bill, and there's the opportunity to do that by including Amendment 4. Stuart Stevenson appears to ignore the fact that under the provisions as they currently stand, a review couldn't, or maybe the delay in reporting a review finding could be delayed to 6.5 years, and I do consider that is far too long. There's an opportunity which should be grasped, I believe, to make sure the bill is operating as intended, and I can see no reason why any committee scrutinising it would not want to firstly ensure how local authorities have exercised their functions after the bill. This is something that we do not wish to sit on the shelf and be ignored, and I think including it after I will in a moment, including this provision after 3 years to look how it's operated ensures that wouldn't happen. Yes,
Mark MacDonald.
I wonder, though, if Mrs Mitchell would agree that her amendment potentially sets a very alarming precedent of legislation prescribing what a committee of this Parliament should do as part of its workload.
Margaret Mitchell.
I think if the member takes time to look again at the provisions, it must be covered in the report. It should be noted the report is limited to these areas but must include comment on them. And I can see no reason why they shouldn't be included on. I think it gives some guidance of the issues that the committee thought were important were included in the bill, and make sure that these issues will be included and have been acted on and implemented and are working properly. If you don't mind, I'll make some progress, and are working properly when the bill is actually passed and enacted. Secondly, it looks at the cost to local authorities, which is germane. Is that stopping them going ahead and implementing the bill as it should be implemented? It looks at the whole definition, and as I say, it gives the opportunity to put specifically in the bill deciduous trees. Stuart.
Macmillan.
Thank Margaret Mitchell for taking the intervention. But does Margaret Mitchell not agree with me that, that if the amendments actually were to pass, that this review will actually take place in this parliamentary session? And does Margaret Mitchell agree with me also that actually that is probably not a good use of parliamentary time to examine or bring a bill forward, pass a bill, and then also have a review within the same parliamentary session?
Margaret Mitchell.
If there's one failing that this Parliament has, presiding officer, it's the lack of scrutiny, and we've just found out from Stuart Macmillan why. If anything, it would set a precedent of we're passing legislation, we're looking how it's working in operation, and we're making sure we're serious about this legislation, and we're passing it because we really believe in its provisions. And with that, presiding officer, then I press amendments.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will therefore be a division. And as this is the first division at this stage, I suspend for 5 minutes. Thank you. We will now proceed with the division on Amendment 2. Please vote now. The result of the vote on Amendment number 2 in the name of Margaret Mitchell is yes 42, no 62. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call Amendment 3 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, already debated with Amendment 2. Margaret Mitchell, to move or not move? Thank you. There will now be a division. Please vote now. Well, the question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? There will now be a division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on Amendment number 3 in the name of Margaret Mitchell is yes 44, no 62. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I now call Amendment 4 in the name of Margaret Mitchell, already debated with Amendment 2 and 3. Margaret Mitchell, to move or not move?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will now be a division. Please vote now. The result of the vote on Amendment number 4 in the name of Margaret Mitchell is yes 43, no 63. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And that ends consideration of amendments. So we will now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 6038 in the name of Mark MacDonald on the High-Hedges Scotland Bill. And before I invite Mark MacDonald to open the debate, I call on the Cabinet Secretary to signify Crown consent to the bill. Cabinet Secretary John Swinney. Please, can I have a bit of order for Mr Swinney?
Presiding Officer, for the purposes of Rule 9A13 of the Standing Orders, I advise Parliament that, having been informed of the purport of the High-Hedges Scotland Bill, Her Majesty has consented to place her prerogative and interests, insofar as they are affected by the bill, at the disposal of the Parliament for the purpose of this bill.
Many thanks. And so we can now continue, or indeed begin, the debate, and I would invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And Mr MacDonald, if you are ready, I call on you to speak, please. 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be opening this debate, and I'm very pleased that Parliament has before it the High-Hedges Scotland Bill, and delighted we have this opportunity to put these new laws in place to benefit people in Scotland. I'm glad that there has been widespread support across the Chamber for the bill. That much was apparent from early in the process, even before introducing the bill, where my final proposal obtained cross-party support. I'm very grateful for the ongoing interest, support and encouragement that I have received from fellow members, as well as the casework. That has helped shape the legislation to meet the clear need and desire for this bill expressed by people in Scotland in their engagement with Parliament on this issue. My involvement in taking forward the legislation has been very rewarding, but I am conscious this is not the first time that Parliament has considered the issue of high hedges, and legislation on this matter has a long history. Indeed, proposals for members' bills were lodged on 3 separate occasions previously, without ever proceeding to be considered as a bill. I am therefore very pleased to be completing this piece of unfinished business. The Scottish Executive consulted in 2000, although the number of responses then, compared to those in England and Wales for a consultation the year before, was relatively small. The more recent consultation undertaken by the Scottish Government in 2009 attracted in excess of 600 responses, 93% of which were from private individuals, the majority of whom described themselves as being in dispute. Not surprisingly, a significant majority of respondents, some 77%, favoured a legal solution to the problem, and over 2/3 favoured replication of the English and Welsh legislation. I am grateful to Fergus Ewing, who had already done a substantial amount of work on this issue while he had ministerial responsibility, not least leading the work behind the 2009 consultation, and this gave me a strong basis on which to build my own proposals. Both I and the officials working with me have met many people and organisations over the course of preparing for and taking forward the bill. These include the Scottish Tree Officers Group, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, the Scottish Court Service, the Scottish Mediation Network, the Woodland Trust, amongst many others. I also visited South Tyneside and Hartlepool Borough Councils for a first-hand account of how the legislation works in England. I also met with the campaigning organisation Scot-Hedge a number of times, and the officials supporting me have met a further range of organisations, including the Scottish Wildlife Trust, RSPB Scotland, Scottish Natural Heritage, the Directorate for Planning and Environmental Appeals. We heard earlier that the Scottish Wildlife Trust and RSPB Scotland have recently written to MSPs to express their concerns at the exclusion of deciduous shrubs and trees within the bill, and I have acknowledged their concerns around the potential impact on wildlife and biodiversity. As I said earlier, I am satisfied that the guidance to be provided by the Government on the bill can address those issues and ensure that those potentially negative impacts do not arise in practice. I am therefore grateful that the Minister has agreed that both the Scottish Wildlife Trust and the RSPB will be invited to participate in the drafting of guidance for the bill. I am happy too that Scottish Natural Heritage have already indicated a willingness to participate in developing the guidance, as they too have invaluable expertise to share on these issues. I am also grateful to the Minister for ensuring that local authorities have been consulted on the potential impact of widening the bill's definition of a high hedge. I know too that many of the issues raised in response were also discussed at the Government's meeting with local authorities on Monday to discuss implementation. I would like to mention one of those issues, and that is the impact of the bill on woodland or forests, an issue that was raised by Stuart Stevenson at stage 1. The short answer is this is a high-hedges bill, so it is not designed to impact on woodland and forest. As a general rule, they are not planted as hedges. I can confirm that the Forestry Commission has been consulted with during the bill's progress, and I am sure that this issue can be clarified in guidance to practitioners. Now turn to the bill itself, and it has become clear to me, and I am sure many members across the Chamber will also recognise, that there are a number of apparently intractable disputes across Scotland that revolve around the presence of a high hedge, with no easy resolution in sight and no apparent willingness to resolve matters amicably between neighbours. In my view, this bill is the best way to achieve a practical and sustainable resolution to this long-standing problem. I will now take a small amount of time to explain the bill. The bill will enable those who consider themselves adversely affected by the height of a high hedge to apply to their local authority for a high hedge notice. It will give these people an opportunity to put their argument to an independent body and to have their voice heard, which is an opportunity they do not currently have. It is important to note that an application must specify all the steps that have been taken to resolve the dispute prior to application, and local authorities can dismiss applications if this has not been done. The local authority will decide whether the hedge is adversely affecting the reasonable enjoyment of the applicant's property. In doing so, it will take account of views of the owner of the hedge and all relevant factors, including the amenity of the wider area. The bill defines a high hedge, and this has been the subject of much discussion. The bill has introduced mirrored the definition used elsewhere, defining a high hedge as a hedge, and that is important in making clear that it will not usually impact on forest or woodland, which is formed wholly or mainly by a row of 2 or more evergreens or semi-evergreens more than 2 metres in height and forming a barrier to light. The amendment that the Parliament has now agreed widens the definition to include deciduous trees and shrubs by removing that restriction. The bill will give local authorities powers to make and enforce decisions about high hedges. The authority can assess the situation and make an independent decision as to whether the high hedge is affecting the reasonable enjoyment of property. I think it is fair to point out, however, that the decision that the local authority makes is one which seeks to strike a balance between the competing rights of neighbours, and the representations of both parties are taken into account by the local authority. It must make a decision having taken all circumstances into account, including the amenity of the wider neighbourhood, and, if it finds a high hedge is having an adverse effect, advising whether any action should be taken. Where the local authority decides that action should be taken, it will issue a high-hedge notice, and that notice will set out what initial action is required to be taken to address the adverse effect and what preventative action is required to prevent the adverse effect from recurring. The high-hedge notice also sets out the time within which it should be done. The bill provides the rights of appeal to the Scottish Ministers against decisions made by local authorities. In practice, appeals will be heard by the Directorate for Planning and Environmental Appeals, and DPA will issue full details of how this will work in practice in due course. If an owner of a high hedge does not take the action specified in the high hedge notice, the local authority will have the power to enter the property and undertake the work itself. It will then be able to recover the costs of doing so from the hedge owner. So, in summary, the bill will provide a mechanism for resolution. Recourse to the local authority is, however, to be used as a last resort. Primary responsibility for resolving disputes over high hedges should lie with the individuals concerned in the first instance. As I have said, the bill also requires that applicants for a high hedge notice must have taken all reasonable steps to resolve the matter before making an application to the local authority. Now, the success of this approach is borne out by the experience elsewhere. In England and Wales, what started off as a large number of inquiries became a number of formal applications, which quickly became a small number of formal complaints and almost no instances of enforcement actions. It is important to emphasise that the application to the local authority should be the last resort, not the first. The bill also provides for a high hedge notice application to be charged by local authorities. In difficult financial times such as these, I considered it important to enable local authorities to recover the costs of making a decision. However, I made very clear at the start that I did not intend for this to be a revenue raiser for local authorities. The bill reflects my view. Fees must not exceed an amount which local authorities consider represents the reasonable costs of deciding an application. Should a local authority undertake work in relation to the high hedge, it will be able to recover any costs in that regard also. As I have said, it appears from the figures that we gathered in respect of England and Wales that a large number of initial inquiries became a small number of formal complaints and even fewer cases of action being necessary by a local authority. This experience indicates that simply creating a formal mechanism for resolving disputes encourages the resolution of most cases without the need for local authority involvement. Scott-Hedge have said during stage 1 that just by passing the bill, 92% of cases they are aware of will resolve themselves. So local authorities can have some reassurance, therefore, that costs associated with the process should not be too high and the numbers of cases involved should be manageable. Now, I was interested to hear all of the evidence at stage 1 and took the opportunity to attend all the committee sessions where witnesses were giving evidence. There was a lot of useful evidence from a number of organisations, including Scott-Hedge, the Woodland Trust Scotland, RSPB, Scottish Wildlife Trust, Bell Ingram and officials from the Isle of Man, Scottish Tree Officers Group and Dundee City Council. We heard evidence that indicated that similar legislation was in daily use elsewhere, with no reason why it could not also work in Scotland. The evidence also indicated that the existence of the legislation, rather than necessarily its enforcement, would resolve many of the problems associated with high hedges. Much of the discussion at stage 2 centred around the meaning of a high hedge and the definition, and this discussion has continued today, and I was pleased to support the amendment in Anne McTaggart's name earlier this afternoon. This will widen the scope of the bill to ensure it can deal with all hedges which are impacting adversely on the reasonable enjoyment of domestic property. Members were also interested at stage 2 in fee provisions, and I've already described the fee provisions and emphasised that this bill provides the flexibility for local authorities to set their own level of fees depending on their own local circumstances. This is a significant effort that has collectively got us to this stage, but for those who will be implementing legislation, hard work is just beginning. As I've said, I'm aware the Government held an implementation meeting in Edinburgh on Monday with representatives from local authorities and others. I know that the meeting considered matters that will be of crucial importance as we move forward, such as when the bill will be implemented and when local authorities will be ready to work with the provisions, guidance from members of the public on what it might contain, how they might meet pre-application requirements, how they might approach neighbours, how they would make complaints, and what the process would be after they had done so, and guidance for practitioners on what it might contain. Issues it might want to address could include other factors a local authority might consider making its decision. So I understand the intention is the guidance will be developed over the next 6 months or so to enable local authorities to put the necessary financial and organisational changes in place to implement their new powers in the next financial year after that. I look forward to the legislation being fully in place and being used effectively, and I am therefore pleased, indeed delighted, to move the motion in my name that the High-Hedges Scotland Bill be passed.
Many thanks. Now calling Minister Derek Mackay. 7 minutes, please.
I'm pleased to be here today for this debate. Our legislative framework to tackle high hedges was a manifesto commitment of this Government, and I'm pleased to see it coming to fruition. Mark MacDonald has outlined the history of this issue in this Parliament, and I do not intend to rehearse that. As he has said, legislation on high hedges has been a long time coming. I think this fact itself highlights just how difficult the issue has been to resolve. I would like to thank Mark MacDonald for bringing this bill to Parliament. It is a significant undertaking, but one which has nevertheless made speedy progress through this Parliament. In February 2012, Mark MacDonald was explaining to the Local Government Committee his reasons for not consulting on his proposal to bring a bill forward, and here we are, slightly more than a year later, debating the bill at stage 3. Of course, this work would not have been able to progress so quickly without the work that my colleague Fergus Ewing undertook when it was part of his portfolio. This was a strong foundation upon which Mark MacDonald could build his own bill. I too would like to offer my thanks to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. I gave the Government's views on the bill to the committee during its evidence session on the 19th of December and followed the previous evidence sessions with great interest. I would like to offer my thanks to the Finance Committee and the Subordinate Legislation Committee also. It is the level of detailed consideration given by all the committees of this Parliament that ensures legislation is as good as it can be. This Government has supported the bill consistently during its progress in Parliament. We recognise that Scotland was the only part of the UK without High-Hedges legislation. Nevertheless, Scotland has benefited in learning from those other parts of the UK, and I hope that members will agree that we have before us today a well-thought-out bill that will address high-hedge problems across Scotland. As well as giving evidence to the committee during its Stage 1 consideration of the bill, I was also happy to participate at Stage 2. During Stage 2, there was consideration of amendments which sought to widen the scope of the bill. At Stage 1, I indicated that the Government has taken quite a relaxed view on that, and we would listen to what Parliament thinks is the appropriate way forward. At Stage 2, I advised that I had written to local authorities to seek their views on the potential impacts of widening the definition of a high hedge in the ways proposed. Earlier this afternoon, I outlined the responses that I received from local authorities in respect of the proposed amendments at Stage 2. I also advised that my officials, who have been supporting Mark MacDonald, will work with local authorities on producing guidance that addresses a number of these concerns, and I am satisfied that the flexibility within the bill enables local authorities to address these and other concerns. The first step in that work with local authorities, as I said earlier, took place earlier this week, where representatives from a number of local authorities attended an implementation meeting with officials. I was pleased that Scottish Natural Heritage and the Directorate for Planning and Environmental Appeals also attended to provide their input. I think it will be helpful for members if I discuss some of the detail of that meeting. This was a positive meeting where those attended engaged openly with my officials on how best to make the bill work as we move forward towards implementation. Of particular interest was what guidance would be produced to accompany the bill and what it would need to cover. As Mark MacDonald has already suggested, this would include guidance for members of the public and for practitioners. Guidance for members of the public might contain examples of the pre-application requirements that local authorities might consider, how people might approach their neighbour who owns the high hedge, and what the process would be after they had approached their neighbour should it have been unsuccessful. It would also detail how they would make an application and how they might appeal any decision. There was also discussion around guidance for practitioners and what it might contain. Issues it might want to address could include the factors that a local authority might consider in making its decision, whom it might consult in certain circumstances, and the impacts on fees that all of these things might have. I was pleased that an official from the Directorate for Planning and Environmental Appeals also attended and was able to explain to those attending the meeting the circumstances within which appeals could be made. This also included how appeals might work, what advice might be required by those hearing the appeals, and how this would be addressed. Also discussed at the meeting was the committee's recommendation in its Stage 1 report that the Scottish Government examine the feasibility of establishing a central tree officer to provide a core of expertise to local authorities. The initial views from the local authorities that my officials met with on Monday suggest that there does not appear to be a great desire for the provision of such a post. However, they would be willing to give it some further consideration. The point that was made that it would also be important to seek the views of those councils who were not represented at the meeting this week. The committee also recommended that the Scottish Government takes the opportunity of the ongoing review of Scottish planning policy to examine the issues raised, such as residential development in proximity to woodlands. As I indicated in my response to the Local Government Regeneration Committee at Stage 1, I am happy to confirm that my officials will ensure that this is considered as part of the review of Scottish Planning Policy SPP. SPP sets out Ministers' priorities for how we plan for Scotland, whilst the National Planning Framework (NPF) sets out where nationally important development should take place. The existing SPP was published in 2010. In September 2012, I announced a review of the SPP highlighting 3 key drivers: to bring the policies up to date, to sharpen the focus on planning's role in supporting sustainable economic growth, and to emphasise the importance of place. The review has been informed by a period of pre-draft engagement seeking stakeholders' views on how existing SPP works in practice, and their views on any priorities for change. On place, we do not propose a change to the policy, but the intention is to draw in existing policy from designing places and set placemaking at the heart of planning policy. The draft SPP will stress that in order to create successful places, we must consider the relationships between buildings, natural resources, travel and other infrastructure. A draft will shortly be published for consultation, and we expect the revised SPP to be in place by the end of 2013. It is also worth noting that the existing SPP contains policy on protection of woodland. This is the very point that the committee made in its considerations. In summing up, I am pleased to continue to offer the Government support beyond the bill itself and into the implementation phases of the legislation. As members have heard, this work has already begun. The meeting that my officials had on Monday with representatives from local authorities was simply the first step. This will be ongoing and invaluable engagement with councils to ensure that the bill is implemented as intended and to provide local authorities with the tools that will help them in that regard. These tools need to be both practical and workable. Given that Parliament has now agreed that the bill be broadened, this implementation work going forward and the provision of guidance will be particularly important. I welcome the bill today and would encourage members to support it at decision time later. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Sarah Byatt. 5 minutes, please. Fairly exact 5 minutes, please.
I take that hint, Presiding Officer. Thank you very much. As with other colleagues, I want to comment that this legislation has been a long time coming, and it builds on the work of a lot of people. I particularly recall my former colleague Scott Barry, who had 2 goes at promoting a bill through the Parliament. And for all the reasons that others have debated during the discussion on the amendment, it has been important that we get the detail of this bill right. I want to start by thanking Mark MacDonald for picking up this issue and for steering it to today's concluding debate. I also want to thank the clerks of the committee and all those who have submitted evidence to the committee and to MSPs more widely as we considered this bill. And I want to thank the committee for carrying its work out on scrutinising this bill. I think that the purpose of this bill is absolutely crucial: to provide a process of resolving neighbour disputes regarding high hedges, which people believe are interfering with the reasonable enjoyment of their domestic property. The process that will now be in place to enable applications to be made to the relevant local authority and giving the local authority powers to settle disputes between neighbours relating to high hedges is a very welcome step forward, I'm sure, by the many people who are currently finding their lives disrupted by the fact that they can't get a resolution to something that is preventing them from enjoying their property. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to be happy at the end of the day, because it's about dispute resolution. And it will put the onus on the local authority to take everybody's views into account and to consider whether or not a hedge is having an adverse effect. It then gives it the opportunity to issue a high hedge notice, to require the hedge owner to take action to remedy the problem and prevent it recurring. And the fact that there's a big stick, if you like, at the end that would enable the authority to take that action, do the work itself and recover the costs. That new framework, I hope, will concentrate minds. And I agree with Mark MacDonald that I hope these provisions will concentrate minds to the extent that some of the long-standing disputes will be resolved through negotiation without having to go through the process that this bill sets out. Mark MacDonald outlined the fact that the provisions are not free. I think that will be something that will concentrate many people's minds. But the key thing here is that although there are a relatively small number of disputes, this new legislation will offer some prospect of dispute resolution so that people can be able to move on. Because anyone who's taken representations or evidence from a constituent who's involved in a dispute like this will know how it actually dominates people's lives. It prevents them from moving on. So I hope that this bill will be of use to many of those people. The fact that there's a right of appeal to the Scottish ministers against the decision of an authority and any high-hedge notice, I think it makes sense, and it provides a very effective check and a balance to the system. Labour signed up to the principle of this bill when it was introduced, and at the Stage 1 debate we argued for a very close look at the detail of the bill, especially on the definition, and we were concerned that some of the most difficult disputes would just not be addressed by this bill, and it would in reality be years before the Parliament was likely to return to the issue. And I think the discussion we had on the amendments today showed that there isn't an appetite amongst the majority of the Chamber to come back to this early doors. So that's why I'm particularly glad that Mark MacDonald and then the Minister were prepared to support Anne McTaggart's amendment and to work with her to get something that they were able to support in this discussion on Stage 3 today. The campaign group Scott-Hedge conducted a survey in 2009 which concluded that almost a fifth of their respondents were suffering from the impact of deciduous hedges such as beech or rows of deciduous trees. So I'm very glad that today we've been able to strengthen this legislation. The worry that there would be a huge number of cases and a huge number of high-hedge complaints in England following their legislation has not actually transpired. So I think the bill does need to be monitored, and we will now have a robust system, because when we add the tree preservation order to this new process, I think it now gives a robust system all round. The representations from the SWT and RSPB do provide a very timely reminder that the local government staff who are responsible for implementing this dispute resolution procedure will need clear guidance from the Scottish Government in relation to the survey work and clear policy criteria for coming to a view on the issues which they will have to take forward at the local level. I very much welcome the Minister's letter in January, which he's now followed up by giving us information about the meeting that was held on Monday. I do think that's very useful. I'm glad that SWT and RSPB will be involved in the process going forward, because I think getting all the stakeholders round the table will be crucial to the success of this bill, and we will be looking forward to voting for it at Stage 3. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now call on Margaret Mitchell, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Once again, I'd like to congratulate Mark MacDonald on bringing this bill to the Parliament, and also pay tribute to all the members, past and present, who have kept the issue alive in the Parliament over the years. Can I also take this opportunity to thank the Local Government and Regeneration Committee clerks for the support they've provided at all stages to the committee's consideration of the bill, and pay also particular attention to and thanks for the evidence which various witnesses have provided, which have aided the committee and helped them shape the bill before us today. The issue of high hedges is an emotive one which has, over the past decade, been debated frequently in this Parliament, not least because, as the Local Government Committee heard in its evidence, of the negative impact these hedges can have upon the health and well-being of both parties involved in any dispute. Today's bill offers a solution to this issue once all other reasonable avenues of settling a dispute have been explored, and as a result of today's Stage 3 debate and Anne McTaggart's amendment, the High-Hedges Scotland Bill allows a high hedge order to be issued against the owner of a property where a hedge is formed wholly or mainly by a row of 2 or more trees or shrubs, rises to a height of more than 2 metres above the ground and forms a barrier to light. If the property owner does not subsequently take any measures to reduce the height of the hedge, the bill then makes provision for the local authority to take action to reduce the hedge height. Arguably, the biggest topic of debate while considering this bill has been the inclusion of single deciduous trees. Although not referred to specifically in the bill, deciduous trees are now covered. Cognizance, therefore, has been taken of the compelling evidence from Scott-Hedge, which suggested that 1 in 5 cases where quality of life and enjoyment of property were affected involved a deciduous tree, and therefore the definition should be amended to include deciduous trees in their own right. This will be a disappointment to the Wildlife Trusts, who argued against inclusion of deciduous trees because of the detrimental impact that they thought this would have upon urban wildlife and biodiversity, and the potential for trees from wildlife reserves adjacent to the housing to be affected by, and also by looking at the economic cost. I hope it will be possible to prove these concerns have not, in fact, been realised. Yes, certainly.
Sorry, Mark MacDonald.
Yeah, I just want to seek clarification. I think I heard the member suggest that single deciduous trees would be captured by the change of definition. That's not what will happen as a result of the change of definition. I just wanted to check.
Margaret Mitchell, I can give you your time back.
I actually said there was a lot of discussion about single deciduous trees, but in fact deciduous trees were included, but not single. Yeah. Maybe it wasn't as clear as it could be. I concede that to the member. Presiding Officer, today I pressed the amendment which would have reduced the review period from the current provision of 5 years with 18 months to then report, making it in effect a possible 6.5 years before this issue is revisited, to a 2-year period with a report within 12 months. This would have meant that an assessment would have been made no later than 3 years after the introduction of the bill, which I still believe would have been preferable given the anxiety this issue can cause. Crucially, it would have included provision ensuring that an assessment was carried out as to whether a reference to deciduous trees should be specifically contained in the bill rather than by default as it is at present. And additionally, and perhaps more importantly, it would have covered any issues arising from the meaning of a high hedge as now currently drafted. Sadly, that was not passed, so it could now be up to 6.5 years before an assessment of the bill and how it's working in practice is undertaken. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, in my winding up speech, I will highlight some of the other aspects of the bill in more detail, but for now, suffice to say, I'm very pleased to see this bill completing the final stage of the legislative process today.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate. Speeches of 4 minutes, and I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Anne McTaggart.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and let me, as I'm sure others will, congratulate Mark MacDonald in bringing home this important piece of legislation. But let me add to that congratulations to Scott Hedge, because I think while we are employed here to legislate, the role of volunteers who campaigned over a very long period of time in Scott Hedge on this issue exemplify the strength and depth that there is in Scotland for people beyond the very small number of people who are in Parliament to engage in the political process in a way that ultimately delivers for the public good. And I absolutely commend them as an excellent example of a voluntary campaign who have endured over a long period of time to ultimately see a delivery on their objective. Now, I say that in the context of, as a North East MSP, my never having been approached in my time in Parliament here on this subject, because simply climatically and with the relatively large areas in which houses are built in the rural area, it has not, to my knowledge, been the same kind of issue it has been in other parts of Scotland. But through Scott Hedge and others, we've had absolutely compelling evidence that this subject is a matter of utter misery for many people across Scotland. I'm delighted to hear from Mark MacDonald in his opening remarks that consultation with the Forestry Commission Scotland has identified one of the things that I previously raised in relation to urban woodland is an issue that can be addressed. I think, as a member of the committee who dealt with this, it's as well to return to some of the things the committee said, and in particular to paragraph 67, which I think remains as true when we wrote it as part of the Stage 1 report now in the amended bill as it was when we included it. And it says, the committee believes it's desirable the application of the bill seeks to resolve as many disputes as possible, but considers it unrealistic to expect any single piece of legislation in this area to resolve 100% of cases. The bill is the simplest way of addressing the majority of cases relating to disputes over high hedges. I think with the extension of the definition, we might say the overwhelming majority. But otherwise, I think, as a comment, that stands the test of time. There are one or two things that have emerged during the passage of the bill which I think are useful. We've clarified that it is perfectly possible for action to be taken against a local authority, even though, of course, local authorities are responsible for guarding the principles and practices that are encompassed in this bill. We included national parks. I'm delighted that Mark MacDonald saw fit to table amendments on that. We learned many things of which we were previously ignorant. I congratulate Christine Graham on her horticultural explanations that we received at committee. I now have heard of Russian vine and of Clematis montana rubens. I still remain relatively ignorant as to what any of that means, but I'm sure other members of the committee who are more engaged in these matters might be well informed by that. I think it's unusual in looking at a Stage 1 report, and I flicked through it while waiting here, that really every recommendation that the committee made, and I'm sure Kevin Stewart, who I understand intends to speak in this debate, will address this matter, but almost every recommendation the committee made appears to have been addressed. It's a model of good parliamentary process, and I commend the bill to all my colleagues.
Thank you very much. I now call Anne McTaggart to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, I welcome the opportunity to once again scrutinise the proposals of the High-Hedges Scotland Bill. I fully support efforts to address the problem of neighbour disputes resulting from overgrown vegetation and agree that local authorities should have the authority to intervene in these cases. My amendment, supported by Christine Graham, has sought to ensure that the bill applies as widely as is reasonable, and that no individual is excluded from achieving a resolution to intrusive hedging as a result of subtle technicality contained within the provisions. It is the responsibility of us as parliamentarians to ensure that measures contained within the High-Hedges Bill are fit for purpose and fully address the concerns communities may have about the local wildlife populations and biodiversity. The current provisions contained within the bill allow local authorities to exercise discretion in their consideration of applications and to take into account the wider effects of a removal order on the environment. I do not believe that the expansion and definition of a high hedge will compromise the ability of local government to protect areas of local and regional significance. Further, I anticipate that the addition of deciduous species to the definition of a high hedge will be of minimal impact in practice. Garden trees represent only around 1% of Scotland's woodland assets, and single trees will not be covered by the provision of the bill. Overall, I believe that this is a pragmatic approach to dealing with a wide range of local concerns, whilst delivering a remedy to those families who have suffered disputes with neighbouring properties for too long. We must acknowledge that the High-Hedges Act, not just as a barrier to light, but lower property values, obstruct boiler flues and block television cables. Overgrown vegetation can cause a variety of problems which make life difficult for adjacent properties and encourage community breakdown. I support the aims of the bill and believe that it is right that those families who for too long have been involved in unsuccessful negotiations will be provided with a resolution to achieve and end to their neighbour disputes. Presiding Officer, lastly, I thank my colleagues for their cross-party support and Mark MacDonald as the member in charge of the bill, and to Derek Mackay for his support, Derek Mackay, the Minister for Local Government, for his support, and the clerks of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee for enabling this bill to eventually be brought and passed, hopefully, at 5 p.m. tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I call Christine Graham, can I advise that there's a little bit of time in hand at the moment, not much, but a little bit for interventions. Christine Graham, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
I usually get told there's no time in hand. This is a first. Can I say all credit to Mark MacDonald, because it's not as easy as it looks piloting a member's bill. I've done it myself. Your colleagues on the committee can be quite tough on you, and I think he's had enough jokes about a private member's bill and cutting it down to size, so you'll be glad to know there are no horrible puns coming in my speech, apart from those which I've trailed. Can I also pay credit to others who have gone before? Scott Barry worked for a long time on this, as did Fergus Ewing as Justice Minister, when I think, if I recall, he tried to pursue it under nuisance legislation. It was difficult to find a way to frame the legislation. I think it was very important to keep it to 2 or more shrubs or trees. And as I said at stage 1, so I'll repeat it again, you know an elephant when you see one, and you know a hedge when you see one. Well, you tried to define an elephant, and it took a long time to agree how to define a hedge. It was tempting to move into the arena of single trees, but I think that would have been a big mistake. It would have opened up, if I'm using a metaphor that doesn't really fit, a whole can of worms. Although I do appreciate these two can raise issues, indeed many disputes, in our neighbourhoods. Again, at stage 2, I said, I think this problem has been exacerbated by higher density housing, together with our expectation of the use of our gardens. My own home, which is 100 years old, just once had clothes pools for drying lots of clothes every day, pre-washing machines and tumble dryers. By the way, this is not a story of my life. This predates me. And I think the only deviation at one point was chickens during the Second World War. Also, I hasten to add, before my time. But what do we do now? We have conservatives, patios, decking, barbecues. We go to B&Q, we go to Dobe's, and some people buy and plant Leylandii. It's called your outdoor living space. And why not? But of course, the genesis of the bill was the growth, quite literally, which I think some people didn't appreciate at the time, of the Leylandii. Undoubtedly a bit of a monster if it was allowed to grow unfettered. If you missed, or worse still, heard my perorations on plants, shrubs and trees at stage 2 at the Local Government Committee, referred to by Stuart Stevenson, you'll be pleased to know I don't intend to reprise them. However, if you're really interested, you'll find them on the Local Government Committee report of 6th of March 2013. Quite the Beech Grove garden. A serious point, though, was to emphasise that deciduous trees and shrubs don't always drop their leaves, and I was delighted to second Anne McTaggart's amendment, per my remarks earlier. And what I like about this is, whereas this bill is heavy-handed in places, you know, with notices and threats and everything else, and perhaps it will just be enough to send the High-Hedges police van with big labelling outside it to get the neighbour to do something, I hope the passage of this bill will be a deterrent, or even better, an education to people, to think about their neighbours, to get the balance right, to enjoyment of their own gardens and their neighbours' gardens, as much as they both may seek to have a modicum of privacy. And finally, I repeat, I congratulate Mark MacDonald, Scott Barry, but I think most of all the campaigners, Scott Hedge, and I would say to campaigners outside this Parliament, it may take time to get there, but sometimes we do, and we do it in a collegiate and cross-party fashion.
I now call Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome this bill getting to this stage today, and also want to add my congratulations to Mark MacDonald, MSP, and also to the Scottish Government for assisting him in actually bringing the bill to the Parliament. At 5 p.m. today, this bill will be the start of the process that will actually help many of our constituents across the country. And I know certainly from much of the correspondence that I've received over the last nearly 6 years now, and also the constituents I've met, the issue of high hedges does blight the lives of many people. And as a consequence, it also hampers the relationships between neighbours at the same time, as Christine Graham was touched upon a few moments ago. I'm fully aware that the bill will not fix every situation, and that's something that certainly within committee, we were very much aware of that. But certainly I think that also, I do believe actually with the extension of the definition as agreed today, that I'm sure that actually that will help many more households and constituents across the country. Those of us on the Local Government and Regeneration Committee are fully aware that the main issue of the bill was its definition. We've heard today of the process that the Scottish Government undertook after Stage 2 to consult further with the local authorities. Once again, I believe that this actually highlights the fully consultative approach and also the process that has happened thus far regarding this bill, going back to when Scott Barry tried to introduce the bill initially, and also up to where we are now. And I think it's certainly regarding the Stage 2 process, I actually do welcome my colleagues on the committee actually not pressing some of their amendments to actually allow the Scottish Government to undertake that piece of work. A further issue. Okay.
Stuart Stevenson.
Does the member agree that the Stage 2 process that we put our bills through can often provide a very useful way of testing the mover of a bill's resolve, exploring issues, giving the government and the member in charge the opportunity to look at what amendments might make sense at a later date and re-engage with some of the people who may be affected adversely or beneficially with the bill, that it's an attribute of the Parliament that we should all very much welcome?
Stuart McMillan, and you can have your time back.
Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with Stuart Stevenson's comments. Because the parliamentary process. I'm sure there is a debate to be had on the parliamentary process, and I'm sure that the committee, or the convener of that particular committee, might want to consider Stuart Stevenson's comments there. But certainly, in terms of the Stage 2 process that we had looking at this bill, it was extremely helpful and useful. I believe one of the other issues raised actually in the bill was the issue of the review. Now, I do want to thank Mark MacDonald for accepting my amendment to review within the 5 years of the Act actually coming into force. And I also want to thank colleagues on the committee for accepting my amendment at the Stage 2 process. And I believe that the amendment I put forward was a measured approach to ensure that the legislation is actually scrutinised in the future and it doesn't actually fall off the political radar. And I believe also that by doing this within the 5-year level, as compared to sooner, as we discussed earlier on today, it actually allows for a reasonable period of time to let the bill, or the Act actually come in, be introduced and also settle, and also for it to be fully utilised. I'm delighted, therefore, that the shorter time frame as suggested by the amendments earlier on today will actually not be pursued from today. Local authorities need to actually have the time to ensure that the bill and the Act actually is working. As all members of the committee know, we heard evidence that there actually will be an initial large increase in demand placed upon the local authorities in the first couple of years of the legislation being passed. And that's actually what happened elsewhere in these islands. But then things settled down. So I actually think having a review in the midst of a potential high demand for local authorities actually wasn't a wise thing to press. And I'm glad that actually Parliament today rejected Amendments 2, 3 and 4. To conclude with, Presiding Officer, this bill is welcome. It will actually aid many of our constituents across the country, and for that I certainly look forward to voting for it at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Jackie Bailey to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I very much welcome the opportunity to contribute to Stage 3 of this bill. I've, like many in this Parliament, been supportive of the intentions of the bill for much longer than I care to remember. But let me start by acknowledging the effort that just goes into taking a member's bill through this Parliament. I've done it before, so I know the enormity of the task. And it's not like being a minister where you're surrounded by an army of civil servants drafting and redrafting the legislation, answering every question about whether it should be an and, an if or a but, or indeed providing copious explanatory memoranda or financial memoranda or briefing notes coming out of your ears, or indeed just general hand-holding, because ministers sometimes need that. But, I know that Mark MacDonald had assistance from the Scottish Government, which would have made life significantly easier, but, that doesn't diminish the amount of work that he would have had to put in as a member, and for that I congratulate him. Because, the essence of any successful member's bill is actually to hit on the right idea that invites consensus across this chamber. Mark MacDonald has done that, and he deserves our thanks for doing so. And it did give me, I have to confess, absolutely unalloyed delight at listening to Christine Graham's gardening tips, and I shall rush to the record of stage 2 to understand the level of interest and expertise that there is on our benches. Can I invite you to come visit my garden and help me with that at some point in the future? But, I know, like other members... Oh, indeed.
Christine Graham.
I shall only attend in an advisory capacity. You will be the lady with the shears, the pruning.
Oh,
Jackie Bailey.
And I was getting excited for a moment there. Clearly, I'm to be disappointed. But, I know this particular journey started a number of years ago with former colleague Scott Barry, MSP, and he's been mentioned by others in the Chamber. And I know Fergus Ewing, too, has put considerable work into this. So I'm sure they will both be delighted when the bill is hopefully likely to pass this evening. I'm equally sure that Scott Hedge, already mentioned, Colin Watson, Derek Park, Pamela McDougall, all of the members who have encouraged us, cajoled us, frankly told us to get on with it, will be equally delighted, not least because of the acceptance of amendments today that will undoubtedly improve the bill with the inclusion of deciduous trees and hedges. And, Presiding Officer, I have to confess to the Chamber, I never thought I would get excited by trees. But, as constituent after constituent came to seek my assistance, I began to understand just what difficulties trees and high hedges could cause. And in fairness, it's not the trees or the high hedges that are the difficulty. It is, of course, their owners and the neighbour disputes that arise when we're not thinking about the impact of our actions, or lack of action for that matter, on other people. And let me just share some of the stories. Mrs A from Shandon, concerned that a neighbour's trees were overgrown and encroaching into not just her neighbouring garden, but another one too. Her neighbour refused to even discuss this with her. He refused to even discuss it with the local authority who tried to help. That was back in 2007. They've still not had a remedy. Or Mrs B from Helensburgh, similar problem in 2008, surrounded on 3 sides by huge conifers, living virtually without daylight, and a neighbour who wouldn't address the problem. Or another lady from Kilcreggan, again in 2008, a similar problem, and she was told you can prune back the branches and the roots which cross boundaries, but her neighbour threatened litigation if she even dared to enter his property. Or indeed Mrs D from Arica, a 60-foot pine tree that was a potential hazard, swaying dangerously in any high wind, and I think we'll acknowledge there's lots of high winds in Scotland. The owner refused to do anything about it, and the local authority was unable to help. Presiding Officer, can I take another intervention?
Stuart Stevenson.
I wonder if the member would agree with me that in the kind of disputes that we get around high hedges, and it's true elsewhere, that you get to a position where the parties to it have taken entrenched positions. Psychologically, it's difficult to get out of it. And that what this bill does, by providing the intervention of another party to focus the minds of those who are in dispute, is a model, probably, of how we should deal with many of these interpersonal disputes that often have been entrenched for decades, far less a few weeks. Jackie Bailey, you'll be in your last minute now, though.
Okay, I am grateful to the member for the intervention, and indeed I couldn't agree more, because many of these constituents have come to me from, as early as I think 2003, 2004 was the first case, to somebody who was literally just 2 weeks ago, and these matters remain unresolved. I've probably had about 30 cases in that period. That's quite a significant number, because the majority of people either manage to resolve the dispute or they suffer in silence. And these are all people who are coming to my surgery because of inconsiderate neighbours. None of them had remedies available to them until now. So tonight, I know they'll be delighted when the bill is passed by this Parliament, because it will make a practical difference to their lives. There will now be a dispute resolution in place, a process that will drive the majority to cooperate without involving the local authority, but nevertheless providing that also important safety net to deal with those neighbours who are determined to be intransigent. Finally, Presiding Officer, Stuart McMillan is absolutely right. Tonight is only the start. Implementation is key, and I look forward to the Government taking that forward.
Thank you very much. Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And like colleagues across the Chamber, I'd like to thank my colleague Mark MacDonald for bringing forward this legislation. and for the dedication and hard work he's put into making sure that it is coherent and will be delivered effectively. I'm sure that the vast majority of members across the chamber will have dealt with a number of high-hedge related cases, and I, for one, am very happy that the government is backing this legislation to finally provide a solution to a problem that impacts seriously on the quality of life for many Scots. As MSP for a constituency which has large scenic areas, often with beautiful views, I found high-hedge disputes to be an all too common occurrence. And I think it's no coincidence that both myself and Jackie Baillie have had a number of these cases, but yet Stuart Stevenson has not. I think this reflects the beauty of the areas that Jackie and I clearly represent in the Firth of Clyde relative to Stuart. I hope he won't remember that when I come up and speak at his Burns Night next February. The effect of high-hedge disputes cannot be downplayed. Friends and neighbours can become bitter opponents. The ability of homeowners to enjoy their surroundings can be severely limited. Property prices can be affected, and issues such as dampness and reduced natural light in the home are all of real concern. In my case files, I've dealt with around 50 such disputes since 2007, and I visited a number of my constituents when invited to do so to see the reality of the situation for myself. A number of times I've been genuinely shocked by the size of some of the hedges in dispute. Indeed, when I went to visit one of my West Kilbride constituents, the hedge in question towered above windows and was blocking completely the lights from the side of the building. A house which should have had beautiful views of Arn and the Firth of Clyde was instead completely shrouded by darkness, even in midsummer. Of course, many neighbours come to amicable agreements about the height of hedges and boundaries. However, there is no doubt that real resentment and bad feeling between neighbours can follow a situation which can get out of hand, and it's clear that some form of third-party enforcement was required. I attended, like many colleagues, a number of meetings in the last Parliament and this regarding this issue, and of course I've met with Derek, Colin and Pamela of Scott-Hedge to discuss how they felt about this matter and how best it could be addressed. It was clear from the information which they were able to supply, often very passionately, that only a legislative approach would be effective, and certainly this is a view shared by many, with over 90% of respondents to the consultation backing this position. I must say I was pleased to note the findings of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, which suggests the bill as introduced would cover 92% of current cases, showing how robust the legislation is. And of course, evidence has suggested the introduction of this legislation and the understanding that the matter can be enforced should assist in smoothing out such disputes without the need for the legislation to actually be applied. And I am also very pleased that deciduous hedges will be included. This helps many of my constituents, and I pay tribute to Anne McTaggart and Christine Graham for their work in this particular area, and was encouraged by the fact that Stuart McMillan's Stage 2 amendment has ensured that the bill will be reviewed within 5 years to ensure that it is effective as we would wish. And I'm sure this will put at ease the minds of many who fear the bill may be ineffective or even too drastic. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I am optimistic this bill will be effective in tackling most, if not all, high-hedge disputes which impact on so many of my constituents. I am delighted that the Scottish Government will support this bill, which has been talked about in this Parliament since 1999, when Scott Barry first raised the issue, and I will certainly offer my support at decision time today. I realise that one or two members were keen on the issue of single trees, but I note that the recommendation was they not be included because of the importance of heritage trees, the proper assessment of biodiversity and other issues, and that on balance this was not included. So maybe not every single aspect of the bill has been covered that everyone would, but I think that as far as most members are concerned, this bill is as robust a bill as we could possibly have produced under the circumstances, and I think it's a tribute to this Parliament that finally we have legislation which is deliverable and can be effectively enforced. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like colleagues, I take my hat off to Mark MacDonald for his work during the course of the passage of this bill. But I think in all fairness, even Mark himself will recognise that his staff played a great part in that too. And I think that they deserve recognition. Beyond that, I would like to thank all of the witnesses who gave evidence to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, of which there were many, the campaigners, the organisations involved in biodiversity and many, many others. And also, of course, I would like to thank my colleagues and the clerks for their efforts during the course of this bill's passage. Presiding officer, I have to say that I was a little bit reticent about adding deciduous hedges into this bill to begin with. However, I have to say that the fact that the Minister has stated quite clearly that the sceptics such as the RSPB and the Scottish Wildlife Trust will be involved in contributing to the guidance on this bill, I think is very helpful indeed. And beyond that, for those that maybe have that slight reticence, we also have the review period, a review period that was put in place to maybe extend the bill at a later date, maybe retract that bill at a later date if that's required. But hopefully, the guidance itself will help in dealing with all of these matters. Presiding officer, we have heard today many of the jokes that have gone on during the course of discussion over Mr MacDonald's proposal. The Triffid Bill, or Christine Graham's Privet Members Bill, puns galore, and a laugh has been had to some degree in some of the fora that this has been heard in. But the reality is, as we've heard from the cases that have come from across the country, this is no laughing matter for a huge amount of people who have been affected by this for many a year. And in some parts of the country, because of the climate, it is obviously worse than others. And as Mr Stevenson says, he has had nothing as an MSP. And I have to be honest and say that as an urban city centre MSP, I have had nothing too on this. However, in the past, as a councillor, I've seen many cases whereby there were huge difficulties caused by High-Hedges. And of course, those problems exacerbated into even greater problems. So anything that can be done to try and resolve these disputes, I think, is worthwhile. I have to say that we have heard already that there has been dispute resolution in certain places because this bill has been lodged here. Now, if that is the effect that that can have, just think what will happen once this is passed and the guidelines are in place. Many local authorities will not have to take the action required because hopefully common sense will prevail and certain folk will take action that should have been taken quite some time ago. If I could move on just finally to some of the evidence that was given round about new development where there has been conflict with neighbours, not between neighbour and neighbour, but between woodland and new neighbours. I think that the fact that the Minister has stated that he will look at Scottish planning policy is, I think, a very good idea. We heard from Dr Maggie Keegan about problems that the Scottish Wildlife Trust had in Cumbernauld. The committee members seen that area for themselves, and it shows how easy it could be for those conflicts to take place. I think that people have got to recognise where they're actually buying a property and what may happen if they are on the periphery of woodland, some of which will not be that old, and there may be substantial growth. So I think that any help that can be given in Scottish planning policy in that regard will be very useful indeed. Presiding officer, this has been a long journey, particularly a long journey for some of the campaigners. 5 o'clock today, I think, will be a great relief for many folks here. But as my colleague Stuart McMillan says, this is only the beginning. But hopefully, some of the people out there will take cognizance of this and will take action now without more severe action having needed to be taken. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the closing speeches. And I was asking members who participated in the debate to be in the chamber for those speeches. I call on Margaret Mitchell with a slightly generous 4 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In my opening speech, I covered in some detail the complex and vexing issue of deciduous trees, but it's worth pointing out that if the amendments that I tabled had been passed, as well as reducing the time for review, they also specified two other topics, aside from how the definition is working, which must be included in any review, namely, how local authorities have exercised their functions under the bill and what implementing the bill's provisions has cost local authorities. These matters should naturally be considered by any review. However, the amendments would have ensured their inclusion. So again, I'm disappointed that these amendments were not passed, given the vital role local authorities have in ensuring the effectiveness of the bill.
Minister.
I know the member is deeply disappointed that those amendments weren't supported, but would the member accept that the provision, the ability, the flexibility is still there for committee to determine its own agenda and indeed its own timescale in terms of reviewing the provisions of this bill?
Margaret Mitchell. Yes, I certainly accept that, Minister, but the fact of the matter is it could be left to 6.5 years before this is carried out. And I think this is especially concerning given that post-legislative scrutiny is not given the priority that I think it should have in parliamentary business terms. And if we are serious about really wanting these measures to be used and to work well, then I think the shorter timeframe would have been welcome. Turning now to some other detailed aspects of the bill, while supporting the bill's general principles during Stage 1 proceedings, Scottish Conservatives sought to improve it by tabling a number of amendments with varying success at Stage 2. These included an amendment at this stage which sought to ensure that ministers will no longer have an unfettered power under Section 34 to alter what constitutes a high hedge for the purpose of the bill. This amendment was one also recommended by both the Subordinate Legislation and Local Government and Regeneration Committees, and it is to his credit that it was accepted by the member in charge. Other amendments in my name were also accepted, which I have to confess was something of a novelty. These included one which places a statutory duty on ministers and local authorities to consult stakeholders before issuing guidance on the operation of the bill. Any such guidance that is issued will have an impact on the way in which property owners, local authorities, solicitors and advisers on high-hedge disputes, as well as persons appointed to hear appeals, will interpret the legislation. I am heartened, therefore, that the importance that any such guidance will have was recognised, as it is imperative that it should be consulted upon widely prior to publication in order to ensure that stakeholders can comment on what is proposed. Furthermore, the High-Hedges Bill, as introduced, initially left it to a local authority's absolute discretion whether or not to issue an application fee refund to an applicant under Section 4. However, in the interest of certainty and to ensure that funds are awarded or not awarded consistently, I tabled amendments requiring councils to publish guidance stating in what circumstances they may normally consider it appropriate to issue refunds. Again, this amendment was accepted by the member in charge, and this is once again to be welcomed. Councils will continue to retain discretion when considering whether to issue a refund, but guidance will ensure that applicants know when they can or should receive a refund of their application fee. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, these alterations do, I believe, improve the bill, which I sincerely hope will help to alleviate the problems and vexations that each of us in this chamber know all too well high hedges can cause. The Scottish Conservatives look forward, therefore, to supporting the bill at decision time this evening.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Sarah Boyack, again with a slightly generous 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It might be quite dangerous. Today, I think we're going to get to a good result with this bill. As everyone said, it's been a long time coming, but I think the extent to which we had a really good, thoroughgoing scrutiny of the draft bill as it was proposed to Parliament has really been beneficial. And I think at the end of the day, the legislation we pass tonight will be a lot stronger. It will relate to people, many more people, where they have damaging proposed prolonged disputes. And I do think it will be of real help to many constituents, not necessarily in every constituency across Scotland, but where there are problems, I think this will be a useful bill. I do want to welcome the fact that Mark MacDonald, member in charge of the bill, was prepared to take a fresh look at amendments across the chamber, regardless of who they came from, and actually to think about the merits of amendments and to think about the long-term impact of the bill. I do welcome that, and I think the fact that we're broadly all able, I think, to be able to support this bill when the vote comes tonight, I think is a good thing. Along with Christine Graham, I think we were right not to go with single trees. It was right to extend the definition, but there is the process of tree preservation orders that exists. So I think this new legislation will complement that. I think for me, one of the comments that Anne McTaggart made about the detailed impact of the bill were absolutely right. Sometimes it's actually about the issue of people not being prepared to maintain or take the responsibility of maintaining hedges is actually part of the problem. It's about making sure that people feel some sense of accountability and some sense of responsibility. Jackie Bailey's list of problems that constituents have brought to her and the comments by other members does actually highlight that for many people these are real problems and they are currently incapable of resolution. So tonight's bill will help that process. I think we now really need to focus on the implementation of the bill. I think there's much we can learn from and build from an experience of similar legislation in other parts of the UK, particularly how best practice guidance works, particularly how people might be encouraged to resolve a dispute before actually using the procedures we're approving. I'm very keen that the biodiversity issues which have been flagged up do need to be factored in alongside the other criteria that will be examined. And we'll need to see expertise developed across our local authorities if the implementation of the bill is to be successful, particularly bearing in mind that many of the people responsible already have relatively heavy workloads. So for that reason, I welcome the fact that the Minister is discussing the issue of Scottish Government support to provide a core of expertise to local authorities. I want to be clear, I don't see that as being somebody in place for all time. I do see this very much as moving to implement the bill in the early stages of legislation. I think that's the key point when workshops or seminars or support about what's in the guidance. I think that is the point at which it will be critical and when people build their expertise. So that's the point at which I think it would be most useful. And I suspect not all local authorities will draw on that expertise. So I think it's very much providing that opportunity for people to make sure that the bill is implemented successfully. The other thing I wanted to comment on was that at the Stage 1 debate, we did have a lengthy debate which came out of exchanges across the chamber, really, about the impact of suburban housing development, the impact of poor quality design by developers, and the lack of long-term consideration in terms of structural tree planting or landscaping. And somebody sitting down and thinking, in 20 or 30 years' time, what will this community be like? What will be the impact of the landscape that we are putting in place now? And I hope that the placemaking issues that the Minister referred to, and particularly the new Scottish planning policy which will address this issue, I hope that will be of practical use both to local authorities in scrutinising applications, but also to developers in making sure that we get strong, good quality proposals that actually use natural heritage and use tree planting and use hedges in a constructive, practical way, but also think to the future of the practicalities for the people who live in those developments to make sure that they remain high quality and attractive developments to live in going forward.
I have to ask you
It's been a good debate. Very much looking forward to supporting this at Stage 3 debate tonight, and I hope that, although it's not a silver bullet, it will really improve people's lives, and that's actually at the end of the day why we're all here. So for those reasons, I'm delighted to support this bill. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call on Derek Mackay. Minister, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think that, as has been said before, the bill in itself will act as a deterrent in terms of the resolution of cases that have arisen across the country. And what evidence do we have that it can bring people together in a harmonious way? Well, this debate this afternoon has shown if it can bring together the politicians of Scotland to reach what appears to be a unanimous conclusion around the issue of High-Hedges, then I'm sure it can resolve cases across the country. I think there maybe are lessons learned on how the Parliament conducts itself in terms of the consensual and constructive amendments that have been received from a number of people that have been able to be accepted by the Member of Charge, and the Government in considering them and taking forward the suggestions that have come from different places. But that approach, I think, has left us with a robust bill. As Stuart Stevenson and Kenny Gibson have mentioned, it will not solve every case in Scotland, but gives us a great framework and foundation from which we will resolve a great majority of cases and present that avenue that's there. Now, this is a very human issue. It may be legislation, and regulation and then guidance, but it's a very human issue, and looking at how we can solve some of the concerns that people have. And I'm struck with some of the evidence presented that we will now give a mechanism to resolve them. One witness at committee said, "Our problems with High-Hedges have caused embarrassment, fear, stress and costly fees to solicitors. None of this would have been necessary if there had been a High-Hedges bill in place and a way of achieving resolution to the problem of mutual hedge dispute." Well, we are, of course...
Christine Graham.
As members in the Chamber know, that passing this bill, if we do tonight, and I'm sure we will, does not actually put it into force, and that only at the time of royal assent do the definitions come into force, but the actual other sections are in the hands of ministers. Now, if the Minister can possibly give us some kind of broad timescale when this might become actual enforceable law, and in any event comment that I think that people are already being told this is the way it's going, whether or not it's in force. But it would be helpful if you give us some timescale.
Minister.
The ever helpful Christine Graham backbencher asks a pertinent question. As soon as the bill receives royal assent, we'll have worked immediately, we've already begun, on the guidance and progress to implementation as quickly as we possibly can, looking at the guidance, taking on board the considerations, of course having royal assent and then leading to commencement, and we'll move as quickly as we possibly can in light of all of that. And in terms of Christine Graham as a member's contribution, I do recall at stage 2 at committee, when there was a particular amendment from the Conservatives on expertise required, and what one single person could bring together: legal expertise, planning expertise, horticultural expertise and casework expertise. Only one such person exists in this country, and it is Christine Graham. We were able to rely on a range of professional and practitioner intelligence to take this bill forward and have a definition that people are certainly happy with. And I know that there was some concern around the local authorities' implementation, and that's why we're working with them to take this forward and address their concerns in the way that I described earlier. And Jackie Baillie has pointed out that the level of ministerial support that's enjoyed in taking a bill through Parliament. Now, I did indicate to officials to support Mr MacDonald in progressing this bill, but that description that Jackie Baillie gave on how well a minister is supported now leaves me with deep and searching questions as to what my civil servants have been doing over the last number of months when Mark MacDonald feels so well briefed. And I'm not sure that my horticultural expertise beforehand was up to mark, but it certainly is now in terms of the understanding of this bill. Now, I jest because I know that this has reached a place where we have consensus in Parliament, but it will now provide a mechanism that can resolve these issues in a very constructive fashion. And I do return to the issue of review. It is important to have that opportunity to review the provisions of the bill in light of practical experience on the ground. And I would reiterate to Parliament that committee of this Parliament, its members, can review at any time, subject to the maximum as agreed earlier on, and in any area how they want to consider the implementation of this bill. So I think it's a proportionate response. I think it's an appropriate response. I think it's been right to take it through the local government route as opposed to a judicial or a criminal route as a resolution to the matters raised. I think this has been the right approach to deploy in terms of the parliamentary response to the issues raised. And I think it is no mean feat for Mark MacDonald to have taken this bill through Parliament in such a timely and effective fashion, succeeding where others, well-intentioned, were not able to have a bill progressed to this stage. So I'm delighted that the Government's been able to support it, and I know that the member in charge now wants to speak more on the final stage of the bill before it becomes hopefully passed with all members' support this evening. So once again, Government is supportive of this bill and will ensure its implementation assists people on the ground through the guidance, through its relationship with Scottish planning policy and TPOs, and I thank all members for engagement in this process.
Thank you very much, Minister. That then allows me to call on Mark MacDonald to wind up the debate, and you have until 5 o'clock, Mr MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. There are a number of thanks that I need to offer. Firstly, to members of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, which has been the lead committee for this bill and provided a degree of robust and thorough questioning and scrutiny as the bill progressed through stages 1 and 2. I would also like to thank the Finance Committee, who robustly questioned me on the financial aspects of the bill, mostly from Mr Gibson himself. But I'd also offer thanks to the Subordinate Legislation Committee, which diligently examined and considered the subordinate powers in this bill, and obviously there were amendments in that regard which were accepted. I also want to thank all those who gave evidence to the committees, both those who attended committees in person and also those who took the time and the trouble to write to committees, often highlighting their own experiences as well. And there are many outside the chamber who did not maybe submit to committees, but who have nonetheless shown a keen interest in the bill. As highlighted by Kevin Stewart, I should also want to thank my assistant Asa Watson, who has, since I announced my intentions to bring forward the bill, been regularly fielding inquiries and suggestions from many members of the public and indeed many members of the Scottish Parliament as well. At the start of the process, the queries Asa dealt with were about what would be in the bill, what would it cover, and now the queries that she's dealing with are about when the bill will come into effect, and it is clear from the caseload that she has developed over this time that there is a huge amount of interest in this piece of legislation. And I would also like to take the opportunity to put on record my thanks to David McLetchie. David took a keen interest in this issue and was extremely supportive of my efforts at the outset, and also proved of great assistance in the early stages of consulting on this bill, and I think it's appropriate that I should put my thanks to him on the record. Now, turning to the debate today, and it's been a constructive and consensual debate, and Sarah Boyack made the point in her opening remarks that not everybody will be happy as a result of this legislation coming into place. And I think the point that she was making, and the point that I have made repeatedly during this process, is that this bill is not intended to be anti-hedge legislation. It's about being pro-dispute resolution. And in any resolution of a dispute or any high-hedge dispute, there is going to be a party who is going to be viewed as the winners of the outcome and those who will be viewed as having lost in the outcome. But the point is about finding a way to resolve disputes, and where the local authority has to take that action, that will hopefully lead to that. But the bill is likely to come into force, I would envisage, after the guidance and the implementation work by local authorities has been undertaken. I would envisage it coming into force sometime early in 2014. So thus we're serving notice, essentially, to those who are in dispute, that there is a year for them to take the opportunity now to resolve their dispute amicably before a legislative remedy comes into force. And I hope that that call will be heeded, and we'll now see many of the disputes that exist out there being resolved in an amicable fashion. I felt it was important to intervene on Margaret Mitchell just to make clear that single deciduous trees were not included within the revised definition, although the review clause obviously does allow any future committee to examine this should they so wish to do so. I'm grateful to Anne McTaggart for her constructive engagement during the passage of the bill and for being willing to discuss the best way to frame the amendment that she then brought to the Chamber to ensure that it had the most impact. And I welcome the fact that we've been able to agree the amendment that she brought forward. And then we came to Christine Graham's contribution, which was as colourful as Christine Graham's contributions always are. And indeed, at stage 2, in fact, we've been thinking about marketing Christine Graham's submission at stage 2 as a gardening book, which we think could be a nice little sideline, given the expertise in horticulture that she demonstrated. But I think Christine Graham did point out that there was a difficulty that I had to weigh up at the initial stages about which route to go down in pursuit of this legislation. Did I go down the court-based solution that was mentioned during the course of the debate, or did I go down a local authority-based solution? And I felt that the local authority-based solution provided the best means to resolve disputes without it necessarily getting snared up in legal process. But Christine Graham also made another point around the fact that people will often purchase Leilandi, for example, is the sort of the main focal point, but without necessarily understanding the impacts that it can have. And when I launched the bill at the Mill Garden Centre in Armadale, Joe McIndoe, the owner of the garden centre, made it clear to me that one of the things that he wants to see is sensible advice being given to people when they come to purchase these kind of plants about the impact that it could have. And I'm hopeful that one of the things that might happen as a result of this is that people will be taking more consideration about what it is that they're planting in their garden and the impact that it might have on their neighbours. Stuart McMillan obviously spoke about the review clause which he introduced, and I think that was a sensible addition to the bill. It means that the efficacy of the legislation can be looked at, and it can be looked at in terms of what has not been included in the bill and might be included in future. And there have been issues around not just the issue around single deciduous trees, but also things around the possibility of future fee transfer mechanisms, which I know Mrs Mitchell wanted to talk about at various stages, and whether the example that exists in Northern Ireland is something that we could learn from going forward. But also it can look at what is in the bill currently and how effectively what is going to be in the bill at stage 3 has worked in practice, and whether changes or modifications might need to be made. And I think Jackie Baillie made a very important point about this, because there has been some cynicism out there, believe it or not, around the worthiness of us having this legislation and discussing this legislation. But Jackie Baillie and Kenneth Gibson both brought to the Chamber stories of individual cases which highlight to us the impact that these situations can have on individuals and constituents. So while some out there might suggest that this is not a worthy piece of legislation to be discussing, I would say to them to come and talk to some of the constituents, some of the people who have contacted me through the process of this bill, and listen to their concerns and how happy they will be at this legislation being passed before they seek to be cynical about the High-Hedges Scotland bill. And I would say to Kenneth Gibson that I was a bit worried when he started his speech that he might be heading towards a rather interesting editorial in the Buchan Observer, but I think he may have managed to resolve the situation in that regard, although Stuart Stevenson is suggesting that he's already drafted up a press release, so who knows, we may have some interesting discussions to follow. I think, Presiding Officer, that one of the things that has been clear throughout this is that a lot of people have campaigned for a very long time on this. And I want to put on record my thanks to those who have engaged with me throughout this process, in particular those members of Scott-Hedge, and I see some of them up there in the gallery today. Not everybody who I've engaged with has been able to make it to Parliament today, but a number of them are in the gallery today. And it does take a deal of resolve, because there have been a number, as we've heard today, there have been a number of disappointments for those campaigners along the way, a number of moments during the course of the campaign where they perhaps would have thought that they weren't going to actually see a bill coming into force, a number of false starts that occurred. And I think the diligence of those campaigners to keep pressing on this, to keep coming back and trying to ensure that this Parliament not only took cognizance of their concerns, but actually continued to pursue and advocate on their behalf the very real issues that they and their members face. And I think it is a great credit to Dr Colin Watson, who I see in the gallery today, and the members of Scott-Hedge, that they have continued to pursue this over a very long period of time. And I hope that they will be satisfied at the way, not just that the decision has been reached today, but also in the way that Parliament has conducted itself in coming to this decision today, and the consensual nature of the process and of the debate. And it was highlighted by Sarah Boyack about the consensual nature, and I think that was reflected in the way that it could have been the case, because the numbers do stand in that way, that I could have simply rejected amendments that came forward from opposition parties. But I thought the most important thing to do was to listen very carefully to the arguments that lay behind those amendments. That's why at stage 2 I was able to accept some of Margaret Mitchell's amendments. That's why I was pleased at stage 3 to be able to accept the amendment from Anne McTaggart and also the amendment from Stuart McMillan. So amendments have been accepted from across the Chamber in relation to this legislation. It has been a long time in coming, Presiding Officer, and Scott-Hedge have always said that what they wanted to see in Scotland was a better bill than that which existed elsewhere. I hope today we've done them justice.
That concludes the debate on the High-Hedges Scotland Bill. We have a point of order from Jamie Hepburn.
Presiding Officer, I wish to raise a point of order under Standing Order 8.17. Presiding Officer, yesterday I raised a point of order and asked under Rule 7.3.1 what steps members could take to correct the record when they have misled the Chamber. At the time, you advised that there are opportunities to correct the record in such cases. Yesterday I was able to point out that an email was sent to COSLA's Head of Media and Communications to ask whether COSLA had made a call for Scottish Government legislation to prevent bedroom tax evictions, or for the Scottish Government to meet the rental income deficit, given claims earlier in the day that they had done so. The reply was no to both questions. Ms Bailey then told Parliament that she had not misled the Chamber, stating,
Mr Hepburn, we heard what Ms Bailey said yesterday. Can you get to your point of order?
Well, just to remind members, she said a motion had been passed by COSLA. Presiding Officer, earlier today COSLA were asked to confirm that such a motion exists. They haven't provided such confirmation. At most, evidence can be found of a discussion of housing legislation in relation to what is or isn't a bedroom, but so far nothing has been found in relation to evictions. Presiding Officer, to mislead the Chamber once may be considered unfortunate. To do so twice might be considered more than a little careless. If Ms Bailey cannot provide us with this motion, can you advise what action is available to you, to this Parliament collectively, or Ms Bailey herself, to ensure that the record is corrected?
As I told Jamie Hepburn yesterday, this is not a matter for me. The presiding officers are not responsible for what members say in the Chamber, and it is up to individual members to reflect on what they say. Ms Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On a related point of order, could I indicate to the Chamber that at the end of February, COSLA considered a motion seeking changes to the Housing Act, and I would suggest perhaps to the member that instead of using parliamentary time in this way, he might want to use it to bring forward measures to protect the 100,000 vulnerable Scots that will face the bedroom tax on Monday. Grow up.
As I said yesterday, Ms Bailey, that is indeed a debating point. Can we now move to decision time? There is one question to be put. Order. Order. There is one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion number 6038, in the name of Mark MacDonald, on the High-Hedges Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. Can I congratulate Mark MacDonald this is, of course, the first Members' Bill in this session to be passed, and I've got great pleasure in declaring that the High-Hedges Scotland Bill has been agreed to unanimously by the Parliament. And on that very consensual note, can I wish everybody a very happy, peaceful recess, and I look forward to you when you come back. I now close the